The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was meant to be a special military operation that would result in Kyiv being captured within a few weeks. That didn't happen. While Russia's forces did manage to approach perilously close to Kyiv in the first few months of the war, Ukraine managed to gain an edge and push the invaders back. Yet for the past 30 months of warfare, Ukraine has been consistently on its back foot, trying to prevent Russia from pushing deeper into its territory. By the start of August 2024, Russia had occupied roughly 18% of Ukraine's territory, while Ukraine had been focused solely on surviving the onslaught of the meat grinder. But the scale of war seems to be tipping towards Ukraine. Perhaps the most pivotal and newsworthy moment in August 2024 has been the August 6th invasion of Kursk by Ukraine. That's right, Zelensky has managed to put Ukraine on the offensive for once, trying to get an advantage over Russia and capture some of its aggressors' territory in turn. How did this happen exactly? Well, the Kursk invasion didn't happen by sheer coincidence. Russia has been slowly shedding its military and economic power over recent years. The Kursk invasion is but a mere symptom of Ukraine being able to capitalize on Russia's more apparent weaknesses. And those weaknesses are only going to grow. So let's take a deeper dive into how exactly Ukraine managed to score a victory on Russia's soil, why Russia can't defend its territory, and what this means for the future of the war. Let's start by outlining the current extent of the Kursk invasion. On August 6th, the Ukrainian army sent a relatively small contingent of troops across the Russian border and into the Kursk Oblast. According to Russian reports at the time, the size of the invading force was around 300 troops, backed by 11 tanks and 20 armored vehicles for soldier transport. Of course, Russia believed that this invading force would be easily repelled by the present border military. Early reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested that that's exactly what happened, painting a picture of the Ukrainian military losing 50 troops and being forced to back away at the border between the two countries. However, the Russian scheme of smoke and mirrors in intelligence reports couldn't hold merit for long. It soon became clear that the Ukrainian army had not only managed to invade the Kursk Oblast, but had done so with minimal losses or even actual fighting. Ukraine was using its long-range artillery and drones to shell Russian defensive positions at Kursk, mainly targeting areas without a significant civilian presence. Over the next few days, there were no reports from the Ukrainian army about the progress of the invasion, and the reports from Russia became increasingly frantic. By August 9th, it was clear that Ukraine had managed to push through the border, occupying an area between 6 and 25 miles into the territory of the Kursk Oblast, depending on the news sources that were covering the event. Regardless of the extent of the Ukrainian occupation of Russian territory at the time, one thing was clear. Ukraine had somehow managed to plow its way into Russia, and it looked like they weren't going to stop anytime soon. What followed was, frankly, a mess of Russia's incompetence and the Ukrainian army's superior experience. Rather than fighting their way through the Kursk region, the Ukrainian invasion was a set of small skirmishes followed by a sweep of Russian troops surrendering as they were being surrounded. 10 days into the invasion, one of the Ukrainian prisons reported that it had already processed over 300 Russian soldiers as prisoners of war, and the warden stated that the number would likely reach thousands long before Ukraine ended the Kursk campaign. So what exactly happened to cause such a distinct difference in combat styles between the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk and the constant back and forth that's going on inside the Russian-occupied pieces of Ukrainian land? The answer is a bit complex, but it can be boiled down to Russia slowly running out of soldiers. Let's start with the more obvious route, the Russian troops stationed in Kursk. According to the prison that's processing the Russian POWs, nearly 80% of the new arrivals were fresh conscripts, who likely had only a few weeks or months of surface-level military training. If the trend follows throughout the entire Kursk region, it's safe to say that Russia has basically been forced to send its newest recruits to guard the border regions that didn't see much fighting at the time. Considering that Russia has been adamant about pushing deeper into Ukrainian territory, it's likely that the more experienced and better equipped troops are being sent to the front lines closer to Ukrainian cities. It's not a terrible tactic per se, but it's shown that Russia does have a few kinks in its military that it can't solve. Why is this important? Well, numbers matter, and Russia should have had a clear numerical advantage. At the start of the invasion, Russia's population was roughly double the size of Ukraine, and similar discrepancies existed in the size of the country's militaries and available manpower. With roughly double the number of soldiers available, Russia theoretically had a significant upper hand in the invasion. But Russia has also been losing both troops and available manpower at an alarming rate. According to Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that outlines Russia's daily personnel and equipment losses, the Russian army has suffered over 600,000 casualties over the past 30 months of warfare. That's roughly double the number of troops Russia had at its disposal when invading Ukraine in February 2022. Effectively, Russia has churned over multiple generations of conscripts to try to win over Ukraine, and its efforts were paltry in comparison. While Ukraine did lose roughly 18% of its territory so far to Russian occupation, 2024 was a relatively stagnant year. Russia was forced to fall back at the end of 2023 and didn't mount a significant offensive campaign until May. And Russia's summer campaign of 2024 was undoubtedly a significant failure. Russia is purported to have lost 70,000 troops over the course of 2 months, setting up a precedent of losing between 1,000 and 1,200 soldiers per day. Worse yet, Russia doesn't seem to be getting better at keeping its troops intact, with the casualty rates refusing to fall below 1,000 per day for months, even after the main stage of the summer campaign can be considered over. Russia did manage to make some progress over the year, but it's not nearly enough, especially when compared to the sacrifices made. According to a report by The Telegraph, Russia has occupied an additional 450 square miles of Ukrainian territory between January and July 2024. This includes the large failure that was the summer campaign. But fast forward to today, and Ukraine has managed to occupy 390 square miles of territory in the Kursk Oblast. Even more importantly, there are clear options for Ukraine to cut off a large swathe of the region south of the River Seine by bombing bridges and other vital infrastructure that connects the area to the rest of the region. If Ukraine retains control of the territory to the east, i.e. going close to Sudza, an administrative center for a sub-region, it can surround the Russian forces south of Seine. If the trend of recruits surrendering before the incoming Ukrainians continues, it can occupy a much larger swathe of territory relatively bloodlessly and gain more POWs in the process. Effectively, Ukraine has the potential to occupy more territory in a month than Russia has managed in 7 months, all the while being on the defensive in its homeland. This neatly showcases the differences between Russian and Ukrainian militaries, especially in terms of technology access and troop quality. Ukraine has managed to make do with a much smaller force, backed by several waves of aid from NATO and other countries around the globe, which provide vital military equipment, ammunition, training, and economic relief. For example, both Russia and Ukraine were forced to use Soviet-era equipment and ammunition, particularly as their main battle tanks and mid-range artillery. Russia's advantage in that aspect was the fact that it was probably the only country that could feasibly make more of the ammunition suitable for these weapons. On the other hand, Ukraine was using up its limited supply of Soviet-era ammo quickly. The US and NATO came to Ukraine's aid, scouring for ammunition compatible with these weapons from all countries they could access and sending it all to the Ukrainian front. A video report by the German media outlet Der Spiegel showcased the situation best. A World War II Soviet artillery launcher was being used by Ukraine to shell the Russian troops with ammunition sourced from Germany. That same launcher was on the front 70 years ago, using Soviet ammunition to shell German troops. Both sides of the war quickly progressed past Soviet-era equipment. For much of the war, the state of the conflict was one of attrition, with neither side making significant progress. The reason? Drone warfare. A foot soldier, or even a tank, was no match for a remote-controlled flyer that could drop death from dozens of feet above, all while its handler was kept safe and sound miles away. Then the war started taking an entirely different dimension, one where the prime targets were drone operators, who became increasingly vital parts of both militaries. Both countries sourced military-grade drones in the first few months of the war. The Turkish Bayraktar TB2 on the Ukrainian side and the Iranian Shahid 136 on Russia's were a large part of why neither army could make significant progress against the other. The TB2 had the advantage over US drones by being nearly 6 times cheaper to buy, while still boasting the ability to cruise independently and slot a few remote-deployed air-to-ground munitions. It allowed Ukraine to make devastating strikes relatively deep into Russian territory, cutting off the Russian army from supplying the occupied pieces of Ukraine. On Russia's side, the Shahid 136s were used to pressure the Ukrainian forces by being relatively disposable one-way kamikaze drones. Additionally, Russia had the economic and industrial capacity to manufacture drones that closely resembled the 136s, giving it an independent supply compared to Ukraine. By comparison, commercial drones were used on both sides to great effect. Since the base models were relatively easy to purchase for both sides, typically sourced from China in one way or another, both armies had a relatively stable supply. Modifications to convert the drones into kamikaze drones were also relatively simple. Eventually, both Russia and Ukraine relied on existing drone designs and sought to improve them. For example, the Skyton Raybird 3 is one of the newest generation drones made entirely in Ukraine. It boasts the ability to fly over 1,550 miles per mission and makes precision strikes on vital military compounds by dropping an air-to-surface munition, all guided by the drone operator and assisted by AI. Additionally, the Raybird 3 included several defensive measures that the Ukrainian army could leverage as an advantage in the increasingly tech-dependent war. First, the drone could be deployed remotely. With the deployment system disassembled a few minutes after the launch, this minimizes the enemy's chance to detect where the drone was launched from and retaliate, which makes it far safer for the drone operator and support crew. Secondly, the drone was designed with anti-interference technology, something that both sides of the war have started using as second nature as drone strikes escalated over the previous year. But drone warfare is just one part of the technological equation. NATO has been approving bolder plans to outfit the Ukrainian army with more advanced vehicles and military equipment. These include the M1 Abrams tank, one of the most modern main battle tanks available to the US military, and the F-16, a fourth-generation all-purpose fighter that heavily outmatches Russia's Su-27s of the same generation. Various NATO countries have joined forces and supplied 65 F-16s to Ukraine, while Zelensky had suggested that the country will need at least another 100 F-16s to have a fighting chance. The F-16s started taking flight in August 2024 after NATO provided months of training for Ukrainian fighter pilots. What does this mean for the state of the war? Since Russia has lost hundreds of aircraft and helicopters over the past 30 months, more than 300 of each, according to Ukrainska Pravda, the new contingent of F-16s will allow Ukraine to gain more of a foothold in its own airspace and provide vital support for its troops across the country. This means that Ukraine's improving air combat or long-range drone capabilities will allow it to put even more pressure on Russian ground forces. It creates a precedent where Ukrainian gains could be more permanent in nature compared to Russia's, which will be vital in helping Ukraine win the war. But as we mentioned before, it's not just the Russian military that's taken a hit over the course of the war. A large part of why Russia is stumbling now is because its economy has been tailored to focus on the military efforts, cannibalizing all other industrial sectors as a result. Let's take the country's governmental efforts as an example. More than 30% of the government's budget has been allocated to the national defense and military, a figure that is far beyond what other modern countries are used to. In terms of GDP, it means that Russia is spending roughly 7% on national defense. Compare this with the US at 3.5%, or the NATO average at around 2.7%, and you can easily see that Russia is trying to pull itself out of the hole it dug by running full steam ahead into military budgeting. Of course, Russia has been able to allocate so much of its budget to its military due to it being one of the largest suppliers of oil and natural gas worldwide. It was previously one of the EU's biggest trading partners for these precious resources. After the invasion started and the EU reduced its dependence on Russia's gas and oil, China and India took over as the largest importers of these resources. Throughout 2022 and 2023, Russia's economy was even seemingly better than those of Western nations, outpacing the predictions made by the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. In fact, Russia is one of the few countries whose economy grew in 2023. Which can be largely attributed to the fact that it managed to get good trade deals with China and reduced its dependence on trade with NATO countries. However, the reliance on the energy sector came with significant downsides. As the magnates in the industry grew richer and could open more positions to fill new roles, people from other sectors, such as manufacturing and agriculture, came to work in the energy sector, leaving the previous ones underpopulated and struggling to meet demands. As a result, China became one of Russia's biggest trading partners in many consumer products, including cars, tractors, and smartphones, completely dominating Russia's manufacturing industries due to lower prices. In contrast, China's trade deals with Russia were also heavily favored toward China, with China getting natural gas at nearly half the price that the EU was paying just a year before. The favorable winds of trade with China didn't last long. While the trade between the countries rose by over 26% in 2023, reaching a record high of $240 billion in yen and rubles, the growth for July 2024 is estimated to be only 1.5% over the previous year. A contributing factor may be that the Chinese imports of crude oil and gas have fallen by 7% compared to the previous year. This could be explained by China extending its global trade efforts by focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative, which ultimately aims to provide China with ready access to Middle Eastern oil. While most of the plans were put on hold due to the invasion, China's ambitions mean they're likely to resume the efforts in case the war goes on. But more on that tidbit later. If China ultimately succeeds in cutting the flow of Russian gas and oil, Russia would end up having very few buyers, which could topple the energy industry overnight. This could be devastating to Russia's economy, since we already mentioned that the other industries have started taking hits as more people left to work in the energy sector. But that's only one sector in which Russia is experiencing loss of manpower. Another major drain that Russia has experienced as a result of the invasion is severe emigration. Immediately after the invasion began in February 2022, Russian citizens were scrambling to leave the country to avoid being drafted or subjected to the pro-war authoritarian regime heralded by Putin's ideology. According to some estimates, roughly 200,000 people left the country within the first few months. By the end of 2022, the number of Russian emigrants has been estimated to be close to 1 million. According to Russia's Alpha Bank, the country has lost roughly 1.5% of its available workforce from emigration alone. The people who left Russia were typically high-skilled blue-collar workers, so Russian companies suddenly experienced severe staff shortages. These numbers have to be compounded with the countrywide conscription efforts over the course of the war. According to some estimates, Russia's military has roughly 1.3 million active personnel, with another 2.4 million support personnel and 2 million reserve troops. It's a significant part of the potential workforce being driven to the front and used as fodder for the meat grinder that is the war of attrition against Ukraine, where unmanned drones and long-range strikes reign supreme. To put another spin on Russia's economy, or lack thereof, Reuters suggests that Russia has a shortage of roughly 4.8 million workers. That's close to 5 million job openings that remain untouched since the country has no capable people to fill them. The country's borders with the Western world are completely closed, and a significant chunk of the emigrants don't have plans to return to the country regardless of how the war ends. All things considered, Russia's economy might look good at a glance, but it's being propped up by unreasonable measures and is largely considered to have gone past the point of no return. With the economy being so dependent on pieces effectively outside of Russia's control, it would take only a few moves by Russia's largest trading partners to cripple the country in the long run. So far, we've spoken at length about Russia's failing economy, but surely Ukraine isn't doing much better, right? Well, the answer is both yes and no. Ukraine has arguably been hit much harder by the war economically. The country is spending upwards of 37% of its GDP on national defense and military, making it the 8th-ranked country in the world in terms of military spending. At the same time, Ukraine has been on the receiving end of generous international aid packages. According to the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations, the U.S. has allocated $175 billion in foreign aid to Ukraine, $107 billion of which is direct financial aid. The rest is used internally in the U.S. to manufacture weapons and ammunition, pay for staff, or send to Ukraine's neighboring countries which are housing displaced citizens, such as Poland. On the other hand, the Kiel Institute reports that the European countries have allocated a total of 110 billion euros, roughly $122 billion, to Ukraine, whether through a combination of direct financial aid or bilateral agreements, with another $85 billion left to be allocated. Altogether, the US and European countries have spent more than $350 billion supporting Ukraine, and that only accounts for direct aid agreements. As a result, Ukraine has been able to stay afloat, even if that's not the best term, by relying on overwhelming support from allies to keep the military running and the equipment flowing into the country. In contrast, Russia is under increasing pressure from most Western countries, as sanctions have prevented it from directly trading in US dollars. The disruption of political relations between Russia and the West goes beyond preventing trade. Other sanctions have also targeted Russia's ability to obtain vital technology that can be used in weapon systems. It's one of the main reasons why Russia has been forced to rely on Soviet-era equipment. When Putin announced that Russia would deliver more than 1,500 tanks to send to the front line, roughly 85% of these tanks were older T-72s, T-62s, and even T-55s, which are woefully under-equipped to deal with the threats of modern warfare. This was evidenced by the fact that Ukrainska Pravda claims Russia has lost around 8,900 tanks and more than 18,000 armored vehicles over the course of the invasion. Simply put, Russia has been forced to continuously use and reuse its old battle tanks and salvage them to keep sending more metal to the scrapyard that the front line has become. While Ukraine has also received some older vehicles, in part because its army has been trained on using them first and foremost, the addition of the M1 Abrams tanks, or the HIMARS artillery systems, presented a notable improvement in the country's military tech level. This harkens back to why Ukraine has been able to successfully invade Russian territory and achieve a significant territorial occupation. Since Ukraine has received so much help from NATO and other allies, the army has put these improvements to the test in the Kursk incursion. The effect is twofold. One, Russia's military morale has started to falter. With the waves of surrendering soldiers passing through the Kursk region, there's a much higher chance that Russian citizens will realize that Russia is not the overwhelming aggressor it claims to be. The new conscripts are nowhere near as capable of maintaining the quality of the Russian army that the country had before the invasion, and the rapid recycling of soldiers will likely only deteriorate that quality further. Ultimately, Russia will be forced to loosen up its offensive efforts on Ukrainian soil, which they ramped up as a response to the Kursk incursion, and send some of its forces to liberate Kursk. By the time the Russian military gets to that, it'll be too late. There are an estimated 200,000 civilians who have been forcefully displaced from the Kursk region. The ones who are in Kursk were privy to the significant difference in how Ukraine treats Russian civilians versus how Russians treat Ukrainians. The invading army in Kursk has delegated significant resources to help the Russian civilians receive humanitarian aid with the help of international organizations. In contrast, the early months of the Russo-Ukrainian War saw multiple Ukrainian cities being shelled indiscriminately. Even today, Russia is still launching strikes on Ukrainian hospitals, an act that goes against the Geneva Convention. Furthermore, the war has been disproportionately affecting Russian minorities. The conscription efforts so far have targeted the poorer, less urban areas of the country, promising wages that are double or triple the national average. Conversely, Moscow has been largely unaffected by conscription, but has seen a significant brain drain as part of the emigration waves. When push comes to shove, Putin might be forced to use Muscovites in the army, and the remaining residents of Russia's capital might finally get a sense of how the country has fared over the past 30 months. If, or more likely when that happens, the entire regime in the country might fall due to internal rather than external pressure, and we might finally see Putin forcefully removed from office. The other advantage Ukraine has received as a result of the Kursk incursion is media coverage. The country's previous efforts were focused on protecting its existing territory and pushing back against the Russian onslaught. By showing that the Ukrainian army not only has the means to repel Russia, but to inflict significant losses in a counter-invasion, the Western interest in the war has likely peaked. If there were any doubts about Ukraine being able to stand against Russia, those are likely being dispelled as we speak, and politicians can look more favorably on sending Ukraine even more aid. Ultimately, this move may very well secure Ukraine a few more rounds of financial aid. This can work in Ukraine's favor to end the war as soon as next year. And that's not an unreasonable claim, considering that the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, outlined 2024 as the pivotal year for the war back in February. The CSIS claimed that Ukraine will spend 2024 in preparation for what could very well be the final push, as both countries will rapidly go through the available financial and military aid offered to them. The CSIS suggested that the final throes of the war will happen as early as 2025, as new tactics, key pieces of military tech, or overwhelming aid tilts the scale in one country's favor. Seeing as the prediction was made in February, it's not unreasonable to suggest that the Kursk invasion is exactly the type of turnaround that the CSIS was suggesting. It aligns perfectly with Ukraine's goal of obtaining more funding, creating a different military tactic from what it used previously, and threatening to tear Russia apart from the inside via moral exhaustion. The advantage for Ukraine is likely to be an advantage for all European countries. In the aftermath of Russia starting the invasion of Ukraine, most NATO countries in Europe have vowed to increase their military funding and modernize their own militaries. Through that, the Eastern Bloc of NATO will likely become more effective and more unified than ever before, and most of that power will be projected against Russia. Simultaneously, Russia's biggest ally, China, has been oddly silent during the war. If China sides with Russia fully, it stands to lose much more than it could gain if Russia wins the war. The US controls a major trade choke point that China uses in maritime trade, and the US Army has been modernizing to directly counter the Chinese threat. With China kept in a stalemate by the US, Russia will inevitably be forced to review its increasingly diminishing list of political and economic allies. With most of the world backing Ukraine, Russia may find itself on the receiving end of a special military operation, this time orchestrated by NATO, to end the war. But what do you think? How long will the Russo-Ukrainian war last, and how will it end? After embarrassing itself on the Ukrainian battlefield for most of 2022 and 2023, Russia seemed to turn things around in the first few months of 2024. Taking advantage of the fact that the $61 billion Ukrainian military aid package from the US was stalled in Congress, the country finally managed to regain battlefield initiative and capture some key territories. The Ukrainian stronghold of Avdiivka fell under Russian control. The villages of Semenivka, Pervomaiska, and Novobakhmutivka followed suit. After fierce battles raging around Chaziv Yar, a city pivotal for Russian advances in the Donetsk Oblast, Russia managed to capture parts of it. The Ukrainian forces started retreating from several areas of the Donbass after being badly outgunned and outmanned by their Russian foes. In other words, everything was falling into place for Russia. So you'd think that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be pretty confident and secure in his position, right? Wrong. It's quite the opposite, really. As July was nearing its end, Putin was in full panic mode. For the first time since the invasion of Ukraine started on February 24, 2022, one realization seems to have started settling in. Russia may have lost the war in Ukraine. But how did we get here? What caused Putin, a man known for his ruthless calculation and steely resolve, to face such crushing dread? And how did Russia go from seeming triumph to the precipice of defeat? We've got all the answers for you in this video. After hearing that Putin is in full panic mode, you might understandably ask a single question. How do you know that? After all, it's not like Putin is likely to broadcast his fears for the world to see. Well, the truth is that actions often speak louder than words. And even the words used often reek of desperation and fear, even though they're meant to project power. As hard as Russia is trying to keep this facade of strength, the cracks are beginning to show. So before examining what made Putin go into full panic mode, let's take a closer look at the key signs of his crumbling confidence. Putin's shocking cabinet reshuffle in May of 2024 was the first major sign that he felt his grip on power weakening. In a move that sent shockwaves around the globe, Putin replaced his long-standing Minister of Defense and longtime friend and close ally, Sergei Shoigu, with an economist with no military experience, Andrei Belousov. Now, for the most part, this move was seen as the most obvious sign that Russia was placing its economy on a war footing, preparing for a long war in Ukraine and beyond. But beneath the surface, this reshuffle signaled more than just an economic pivot. It signaled that Putin's worst fear, the rise of his Kremlin rivals, was potentially becoming a reality once again. And after the disastrous impact of Yevgeny Prigozhin's June 2023 rebellion, Putin couldn't take any chances. By removing Shoigu from his post, Putin effectively neutralized an ally who became a little too powerful for Putin's liking. Most Russians perceived Shoigu as a familiar and respected minister who had served Russia honorably for 12 years. Putin also believed this before the invasion of Ukraine, sharing quite a close and public friendship with Shoigu. But as the situation in Ukraine worsened, the Russian public had to bid farewell to the many macho photos of Putin and Shoigu sunbathing bare-chested in Siberia, going on fishing trips and playing hockey. The choice between friendship and power proved to be an easy one for Putin. And that's precisely what the Russian political scientist Mikhail Sava believes Putin achieved by removing Shoigu from his cabinet. He removed any threat to his power. Shoigu's replacement, Belousov, described as a trustworthy bureaucrat, is only interested in economic matters. He has no ambitions to lead the Russian armed forces, build a parallel power base, or even meddle in important military issues. The general staff of the Russian armed forces will be in charge of those, while Belousov focuses on securing the necessary funding for Russia's war machine. Belousov also doesn't have a loyal base of supporters like Shoigu. He's just a scientist who owes his position to Putin alone, and thus Putin alone warrants his loyalty. To secure this loyalty from other key figures in the cabinet, Putin started appointing their children to high-profile positions and lucrative state contracts. So Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Nikolai Patrushev, who many consider to be the second most powerful man in Russia, was appointed Deputy Prime Minister for Agriculture. Similarly, Boris Kovalchuk, the son of Yuri Kovalchuk, reputed to be Putin's personal banker, became the chairman of the Accounts Chamber of Russia. Through these moves, Putin is also securing the loyalty of the next generation of political leaders, eliminating future threats to his regime. Of course, there are no guarantees in the cruel world of politics, as Prigozhin proved, so Putin's efforts to fortify his position are fraught with risk. But even if they weren't, even if they were rock solid, the mere fact that Putin was forced to make these moves speaks volumes about his current state of mind. So do Putin's threats of nuclear war. Now, we know what you're thinking, old news. And yes, Putin has been threatening to deploy nuclear weapons virtually since the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion. However, the threats and this dangerous rhetoric dramatically intensified in the last few months, clearly showing just how desperate and panicked Putin is. In an effort to convince the world he isn't bluffing once again, he reiterated that Russia would use all means at its disposal to protect its sovereignty at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He added, for some reason, the West believes that Russia will never use it. Conveniently ignoring the very reason for this belief is his history of making empty threats and nuclear saber-rattling. Of course, Russian officials, state media, and publications are quick to take Putin's word for it, plastering nuclear threats across headlines and broadcasting them with fervor. But these threats aren't the only outlandish thing the Russian media keeps pushing. Believe it or not, Russia's state-controlled media outlets are now trying to convince Russian people to join the war by promising them that they will be resurrected if they get killed on the battlefield. Yep, you heard that right. The state media is also painting Russia's invasion as a holy war, presenting the Russian armed forces as the embodiment of the forces of good and describing individual soldiers as the forerunners of Jesus' forces. It's a lethal mix of delusion and desperation. However, in actuality, the desperation in this department is quite justified, given how many troops Russia has lost in Ukraine. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 570,120 troops. Combine this staggering number of casualties with the two waves of forced mobilization, 137,000 troops in August 2022 and 170,000 troops in December 2023, combined with the 300,000 Russian citizens who had fled the country, and it becomes obvious that the Kremlin is facing a dire manpower crisis. The fact that he's gradually running out of soldiers to send to certain death might have contributed to Putin's apparent readiness to hold peace talks, announced on June 14th. While this would surely be monumental news coming from any other warring leader, in Putin's case it's tinged with skepticism, especially when the terms Putin proposes for this peace initiative heavily favor Russia's strategic interests rather than offering any genuine concessions. According to him, fighting would stop if Ukraine would withdraw its troops from the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts and refuse to join NATO. Ukraine, on its part, slammed this proposition as an ultimatum, labeling his options for ending the war as absurd. Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, also added that these statements contained nothing new. But Minister Kuleba is wrong. There is something new in Putin's June 14th statement, a hint of desperation. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte was the first to point this out publicly. During the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, Rutte said that Putin's alleged readiness to hold peace talks indicates that he's panicking. His exact words were, "Obviously, since he came up with this crazy proposal for peace yesterday, it shows us that he's panicking." However, Rutte still seems to believe peace is possible for the war in Ukraine and that it could be achieved at a similar summit. In fact, the Dutch official voiced his disappointment over Putin not attending the June 2024 summit in Switzerland, saying, "The train will not move without Russia." To be fair, Russia and Putin weren't invited to attend the Global Peace Summit, which ended up hosting about 100 delegations with 57 heads of state and governments from all over the world. However, the reason why Russia wasn't invited was the country's public flagging that it would not participate. But even if it did, it would hardly change anything. Putin needs the war in Ukraine to continue for his regime to survive. If the war comes to an end, regardless of the side that prevails, he will be left to grapple with the disastrous consequences of his war economy that Russians will no longer be able to ignore. Then again, Russians are already starting to catch on, despite the relentless propaganda keeping them in the dark. And they have a single item to thank, the first reason on our list for Putin to panic: eggs. That's right, eggs have come to symbolize the economic turmoil in Russia. They've become so expensive that they're even sold individually in some shops, going for as high as 23 cents an egg. Of course, they aren't alone, with numerous other basic ingredients soaring in price due to massive labor market shortages, high energy costs, and the plunging ruble. The situation has gotten so dire that Putin fears Russians might take to the streets to protest. This is also the first of many occurrences that set off Putin's panic mode, which we'll discuss in this video. In the same way Putin fears the rise of Kremlin rivals, he also fears the power of public unrest. That's why his regime ordered the Russian security services to take action and finally address the shocking prices and shortage of eggs and other staples. Russia is even resorting to importing eggs from Turkey and Azerbaijan to fill the gap, a stark contrast to the 98% of nationally sourced eggs before the war. Of course, eggs are far from the only reason why Putin is in full panic mode, and far from the most crucial one. That honor belongs to the second reason on our list, which is that Ukraine is now allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to strike targets on Russian soil. This monumental decision came in May 2024, when ally after ally started giving Ukraine the green light on the matter, instantly sending Putin into full panic mode. You see, before May, Ukraine was only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons on Russian targets within Ukrainian territory, that is, the parts occupied by Russia. This allowed Russia to wreak havoc all across Ukraine, while Ukraine was only allowed to respond within the confines of its own borders. With this new change of policy, Ukraine can use a wide variety of advanced weaponry to strike Russian targets beyond the occupied Ukrainian regions. However, there's also a major but involved. Ukraine can target Russian territory, but only within specific areas and military targets. For instance, the Russian armed forces launched a massive offensive in the Kharkiv region on May 10th, so the US allowed Ukraine to hit the Russian targets surrounding this border region, which were heavily involved in carrying out this offensive. Other countries like France, Germany, and the UK followed suit, allowing Ukraine to do the same with the weapons they supplied. But what kinds of weapons are we talking about here? Well, Ukraine can use most of its air defense systems, rockets, and artillery. Long-range missiles are still off limits, but this new policy shift opens up a range of high-impact options. To be more specific, Ukraine can now use the following weapons and equipment to strike predefined targets in Russia: the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jet supplied by the Netherlands and Denmark, Su-25 close air support jets donated by Northern Macedonia, Scalp Egg air-launched cruise missiles supplied by France, Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles delivered by the UK, the Bayraktar TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles provided by Turkey, and HIMARS and ATACMS missiles supplied by Germany, the US, UK, and Norway. Of course, the permission to use these weapons on Russian soil alone is by no means enough for Ukraine to win the war. However, it's more than enough to finally shift the balance of power and give Russia the taste of its own medicine. As an anonymous senior Ukrainian officer put it in a call with CNN, the Russian military can no longer feel impunity and security. The newly granted permission has already had a huge impact, allowing Ukraine to destroy several important targets inside Russia and conduct a successful counteroffensive. It's also stopped Russia from targeting the Kharkiv region with its S-300 and S-400 systems. How so? Ukraine started carrying out strikes on targets in the Belgorod region using the HIMARS missiles, which forced the Russians to move their surface-to-air missile systems much further away, putting ground targets in Kharkiv out of their range, that range being 75 miles for the S-300 system and 120 miles for its S-400 counterparts. As for the aerial targets like aircraft and missiles, both systems have an operational range of 250 miles. When struck by Ukrainian HIMARS, these systems were located roughly 40 miles from the front line in the Kharkiv region and 50 miles from the city of Kharkiv itself. Safeguarding Kharkiv from the S-300 threat has provided significant relief to the city of Kharkiv, which is also targeted by aerial glide bombs dropped from fighter jets from a distance of some 40 miles. However, there's one particular target that seems to be inducing the most panic in the Kremlin: the Crimean Bridge. As its name suggests, the 12-mile bridge is located on the Crimean Peninsula and serves as a crucial artery connecting the peninsula to mainland Russia. Since its construction in 2018, this bridge, also known as the Kerch Strait Bridge, has facilitated the movement of Russian troops, supplies, and resources between the peninsula and the mainland. However, the bridge has also served as a symbol of Russian control and a testament to Moscow's claims over Crimea, which makes it one of the prime targets for Ukrainian forces. So far, Ukraine has managed to hit the bridge twice, in October 2022 and July 2023. Both times, strike drones were involved in the attack. While these strikes managed to badly damage parts of the bridge, they failed to achieve Ukraine's ultimate goal, completely severing Russia's crucial supply line to Crimea. But the newly delivered ATACMS, a coveted long-range missile system manufactured in the US with a range of up to 190 miles, could change this. That's why the renewed flow of military aid from the US to Ukraine is another source of panic for Putin and the Kremlin, the third on our list. But how do we know Ukraine is eyeing the Crimean Bridge? Well, besides the obvious strategic value of this bridge, a senior Ukrainian diplomat has also dropped a major hint. In a post shared to X, formerly Twitter, Sergei Kyslytsya, Ukraine's permanent representative in the United Nations, listed 6 main types of bridges. Each of the types was accompanied by a diagram showing what the bridge type looks like. But in the 6th slot, there weren't any bridges, just an empty space with the words Kerch. For those who can read between the lines, the message was more than clear. The Kerch Bridge will be no more. The 4th reason for Putin's justified panic is the overall change in how the West approaches the war. For the better part of almost 30 months of warfare, the US and Western allies weren't going all in to help Ukraine. First, the West was wary of provoking Russia too much, fearing the escalation that might ensue. It's almost as if Ukraine wasn't allowed to win the war because of what a Russian loss might mean for the rest of Europe. Next, the West was seemingly hoping Putin would stop at some point, realizing that his aggressive expansionism would ultimately be unsustainable and self-defeating. This is also partially why the US waited for so long before greenlighting the use of its weapons inside Russia. Think of it this way: Ukraine doesn't want the war to continue. The US doesn't want the war to continue. NATO doesn't want the war to continue. And the rest of the world doesn't want the war to continue. It was only logical to assume that Russia could also be added to that list. Unfortunately, it became evident that Putin had no intention of stopping. In addition, he's obviously looking to expand the war beyond the Ukrainian borders. As a result, the West finally realized that a change of tactics was more than necessary. So the strategy is no longer Russia can't lose and Ukraine can't win. The strategy is now Ukraine will win the war. Ukrainian armed forces have seemingly sensed the change, lending them to fight more valiantly than ever. This leads us to the 5th source of Putin's panic: Ukraine's everlasting resilience. Even though Ukrainian forces are the ones heavily outgunned and outnumbered, the Russian troops are the ones taking more hits. According to Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia suffers 3 times the number of casualties than Ukraine. In some areas, this ratio is even higher. Russia has also suffered heavy equipment losses since the beginning of the invasion. According to the July 24th report from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost the following equipment in the war: 8,302 tanks, 16,013 armored fighting vehicles, 21,279 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,759 artillery systems, 1,125 multiple launch rocket systems, 902 air defense systems, 363 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,544 drones, 28 ships and boats, 1 submarine. Of course, Ukraine has suffered heavy losses in this department as well, but not before taking full advantage of the equipment. For instance, a UK-based think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, estimated that Ukraine loses a staggering 10,000 drones monthly, but this high figure has to do with Ukraine's aggressive use of drones in combat roles. Simply put, Ukrainian drones have been wreaking havoc on Russia. They are the reason the Black Sea Fleet has all but retreated from Crimea, despite standing against a country that has virtually no navy. Ukraine has also been using drones to sow panic and fear across Russia, wiping out major targets in the process. The targets in question are mostly air bases, oil depots, and industrial sites. In other words, locations whose destruction can disrupt Putin's relentless war machine. In one of the latest attacks, 47 drones targeted the Rostov region, badly damaging the Morozovsk airbase, home to various Russian fighter jets, including Su-34s, Su-24s, and Su-24Ms. The 5 areas that were hit were the location of an S-300-400 air defense system, the parking area of an Su-24 fighter jet, another parking area for fighter jets, a fuel and lubricants warehouse, and the runway. With strategic moves aimed at appeasing the people of Russia and its government, it's clear that Ukraine remains the biggest threat to the survival of Putin's regime. After all, we're talking about a man who takes out his opponents almost preemptively before they get a real chance to threaten his grip on power. Think Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. So the fact that this great enemy of Russia, Ukraine, just won't relent and continues to challenge his authority is a source of profound anxiety for Putin. The same goes for his many miscalculations in the war in Ukraine, the 6th source of panic. Remember, the very invasion of Ukraine was launched based on a miscalculation. Putin's yes men promised him that he could take Kyiv in 3 days or so after swarming it with 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles. Of course, this didn't happen. Kyiv is still very much standing. Since the beginning of the invasion, there has been one miscalculation after another, and even Putin, despite his usual arrogance, can't ignore the mounting evidence of his errors. Speaking of his miscalculations, another international one is sure to make Putin sweat. Joe Biden dropping out of the 2024 US presidential race. You see, Putin was all but convinced that Donald Trump would get re-elected in November, as his opponent was widely painted as an old and sickly man who can't be trusted to lead the most powerful nation in the world. Of course, this worked in Putin's favor, as Trump famously promised to shake up NATO, even threatening to pull the US from the alliance altogether. With a weakened NATO, Putin would have little trouble advancing his strategic ambitions, both in Ukraine and beyond. But Putin's dreams of an easy path to victory were shattered on July 21, 2024, when it was announced that Biden would no longer run for re-election and that he endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, as his replacement. The news stirred up quite the commotion in the US and the rest of the world, Russia very much included. Russian state officials started complaining on national TV that Biden's move was a disaster for Trump's re-election chances. As Oleg Matvichev, a member of the State Duma, put it, previously, Trump could easily attack Biden's health. Now he has nothing left to attack. He added that Trump's campaign switched to attacking Harris, but nothing new will stick to her. Of course, the US presidential race is far from over, but it's easy to see why Putin and those around him are panicking. If elected, Harris's policies toward Ukraine is likely to remain similar to Biden's, which means support for as long as it takes. Harris has previously attended 3 consecutive Munich security conferences, meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky at each. Though her first appearance was 5 days before the full-scale invasion started, Harris used the other 2 meetings with Zelensky to reiterate US support for Ukraine. Harris has also continuously reiterated that Russia must pay for its war crimes, which shouldn't be surprising, given her background as Attorney General. She also insists that the only way for the war in Ukraine to end is with Ukraine as a nation that is free, democratic, and independent. So there you have it. Putin's full panic mode now makes much more sense, doesn't it? But the good news is that the West still has a few cards up its sleeve, which could easily push Putin into an even deeper state of desperation. The first is to allow Ukraine to hit more targets using Western-supplied weapons. Though lifting all limitations is the ultimate goal, even a simple expansion beyond areas directly targeting Ukraine would do wonders for the country's war effort. Ideally, Ukraine should be able to hit Moscow, because there's no more important city in the entire country. Russia is Moscow, and Moscow is Russia. For now, the people of Moscow are mostly unaware of the war raging some 500 miles away. Sure, they've experienced the fluctuating economy, but they have no idea of the full scale of devastation and chaos unfolding in Ukraine. The Russian elites were a bit shaken when the war first started, but by now they're used to it, giving it no second thought in their day-to-day lives. So the only way to truly get to Putin is to make Russia feel the war. As the Ukrainian historian Yuri Felshtinsky puts it, Felshtinsky believes that it's also the only way to ultimately defeat Russia and prevent further escalation. The West, and the US in particular, can also instill more fear in Putin by providing additional military aid to Ukraine. After all, in the 5 months when US aid was withheld was when Russia turned the tables. Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are vocal about the massive impact this aid has. In the words of an officer with the 148th Artillery Brigade, "We can see the impact of the aid every day. Artillery, longer-range multiple-launch rocket systems with various types of ammunition and submunitions, it's affecting the overall battlefield picture." The last thing that the West can do to make Putin sweat doesn't have anything to do directly with Ukraine. It refers to changing the regime in Belarus, Russia's only remaining ally in the region. While Alexander Lukashenko is in power, Putin will continue using Belarus as a starting point for his military operations in the region, potentially advancing against the entirety of Europe. Recently, Putin even moved part of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons arsenal to Belarus, suggesting that the first nuclear strikes could be launched from its territory. Defeating Putin, while the war is still limited to only Ukraine, is the only way to prevent a World War III-like escalation, and taking Lukashenko out of the picture would certainly help achieve that goal. Of course, there's always the question of what Putin will do if he's backed into a corner. As of 2024, Russia possesses 5,850 nuclear warheads, the most in the world, which is why a nuclear war is the first thing to come to mind when thinking of a potential escalation. It doesn't help that Putin has been rather cavalier about the potential use of these weapons, leaving the rest of the world in just as much panic as he's currently experiencing. But what do you think? Is there a way to push Putin to the edge without provoking World War III? And if so, what do you think will be the straw that breaks the camel's back? 2024 was supposed to be the year of recovery, but for who? Putin's relentless push to swell the ranks has made the Russian army one of the largest in the world, with 1.3 million active soldiers and another 2 million in reserve. But this show of force came at a steep cost on the Russian home front, one that Russia is about to pay in blood. Meanwhile, Zelensky kept Ukraine's plans for the latter half of 2024 shrouded in secrecy, offering only cryptic hints of a strategy in motion. NATO, after months of waiting, finally began delivering F-16 fighter jets in July, following Congress's approval of a $60 billion aid package in April. The first half of the year was spent preparing for war, the second half unleashing it. And yet, despite Russia's overwhelming numbers and resources, Putin is teetering on the brink of a catastrophic defeat. Russia reinvigorated its efforts to invade and occupy Ukraine in May 2024. On paper, Russia had plenty of avenues to win the war. It had the manpower advantage as a result of relentless conscription campaigns and the fact that Ukraine had a little less than half of Russia's population to begin with. It had the material advantage, being perhaps the only country that produced the ammunition that the Soviet-era tanks and artillery batteries used, and which were the main military equipment on both sides of the war. The US Congress had previously spent months bickering about sending more aid to Ukraine, believing that funding the war would be a pointless effort. Yet throughout all that, the so-called summer invasion was a resounding failure for Russia, perhaps due to the bizarre choices made by the Russian military command. You see, apart from the initial blitzkrieg attempt at reaching Kyiv from the north, which was repelled within a few months of the invasion starting, Russia has focused most of its efforts on occupying the eastern and southern points of Ukraine. The former was a relatively obvious target, with Russia already annexing Crimea 10 years ago and having a much greater geopolitical presence in the surrounding Ukrainian regions to begin with. The latter was done to prevent Ukraine from being able to export goods, as Ukraine is a significant grain exporter across the Black Sea. Therefore, most of 2023 was spent with Russia putting more pressure on the eastern side of the Russo-Ukrainian front, occupying the Donetsk region. The Russian army's next goal in the area for 2024 was naturally going to be the largest city in the region, that being Pokrovsk. The 60,000 population city is the transportation hub between the eastern front and the rest of Ukraine, so Russia was trying to capture the city as part of the 2024 summer campaign made sense in a way. However, what happened was nothing short of a moment of impulsiveness. Instead of going for the eastern front, the main Russian force during the May and June campaigns was focused on the northern city of Kharkiv. That's the same city and the same region that was under siege in the first few months of the invasion all the way back in 2022, and which the Ukrainians retook by September of that year. Additionally, rather than pressing into the Kharkiv region with armored vehicles and tanks supported by long-range artillery strikes, Russia heavily favored infantry-based tactics. From the reports in the area, Russia used cobbled-together turtle tanks, which were unwieldy armored vehicles, with the goal of absorbing as much Ukrainian fire as possible and giving more breathing room to the infantry forces. For infantry, Russians turned to equipping troops with motorcycles to give them more maneuverability and speed compared to traditional armored vehicles. Apparently, the goal of the summer campaign was to cover as much ground as possible, as fast as possible, using as little of Russia's heavy armor as necessary. This could stem from the widespread shortage of tanks that Russia could allocate to the campaign in the first place. In 2023, it became apparent that Russia was running out of modern armor. Russia's most modern battle tank was the T-90, effectively an upgraded version of the old T-72 that was manufactured throughout the Soviet era. However, Ukraine has been able to deal with the T-90s via the gifted tanks from the West and by exploiting the tank's critical weak spot under the chassis, the autoloader. Unlike the Western tanks, the T-90, as well as the T-72, uses an auto-loading mechanism, but also stores excess sensitive ammunition, which is located under the turret. If an explosion, such as the one delivered by mine or drone, the latter of which Ukraine has become bona fide experts in, hits the turret, there's a chance that all the stored ammunition detonates and obliterates the tank. By removing Russia's more modern tanks from the equation, both Russia and Ukraine have mainly relied on the contingent of older Soviet-era tanks like the T-72s, T-62s, and even older T-55s. The Western sanctions on Russia have prevented it from getting more modern pieces of equipment, which resulted in Russia being forced to salvage or re-equip Soviet tanks to use in the war. Even with that, a bulk of the tanks were being sent to the Eastern Front. That led to the strange situation where Russia has mainly used infantry tactics to make headway into the Kharkiv region. For the first few weeks of the summer offensive, Russia did see some progress, managing to eke some 10 miles into Ukrainian territory, but nowhere near close to the city of Kharkiv itself. The losses that Russia accumulated over the summer offensive were staggering. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the invading force contained between 30,000 and 70,000 soldiers, leading to a significant increase in daily losses incurred by Russia. Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that tracks daily losses, suggests that Russia has been losing over 1,200 soldiers per day across all fronts throughout the summer offensive. Over the course of May and June, the months with the most activity on the newly opened Kharkiv front, Russia suffered around 70,000 casualties. That's a significant blow to the already failing Russian morale and attempts to improve the troop count, with many comparing the Russian tactics to feeding soldiers into a meat grinder for no apparent reason. So what was the ultimate goal behind the summer offensive? Some strategists suggest that Russia was confident that the lower estimate of 30,000 troops would be enough to dig deep into Ukrainian territory and capture Kharkiv. After all, Ukraine itself has focused its efforts on fortifying the Eastern Front, so it wasn't out of the realms of possibility to consider that Kharkiv would be sparsely defended as a result. Other tacticians believe that the Kharkiv offensive was meant as a diversion. Its goal was to make Ukraine think that Russia was putting most of its efforts into occupying Kharkiv, forcing the Ukrainian army to change gears and fall back from the Eastern Front to defend the north. Either way, Russia was planning to use Kharkiv as a means to an end, with that end being making more progress on the Eastern Front. However, all the Russians ended up doing was falling into a massive trap. The Kharkiv invasion, ill-equipped and poorly planned as it was, turned out to be a massive failure. Despite early gains, Russia couldn't maintain the momentum, and Ukraine managed to reinforce the area with minimal setbacks on the Eastern Front. The Russian army was forced to retreat relatively quickly, allowing Ukraine to retake the occupied villages near the border and proclaim victory in that battle. Granted, Russia managed to gain some territory in the east, roughly 400 square miles, but it came at the cost of 70,000 soldiers, significant losses in tanks and other armored vehicles, and the main target of Pokrovsk was still relatively safe. And remember, by the time Russia started the summer invasion, Ukraine still had yet to receive the financial and military aid that the US Congress announced in April. When the summer offensive was over, that money and equipment started to trickle into the country. Now it was up to Ukraine to make the move. And so we come to the beginning of August 2024, when Ukraine made one of the most surprising yet effective advances in the past 18 months of warfare, the invasion of Kursk. On paper, the Kursk region should have the same amount of defenses on the Russian side as Kharkiv did on the Ukrainian side. Both regions are on the border between the two countries and therefore have a high potential of being used as part of the northern front in the war. However, Ukraine went in with a much smaller contingent, some reports suggesting around 1,000 troops only, and completely swept through Russia's defenses in the area. More troops followed soon, creating an organized yet mobile invading force that could occupy one village after another without setting down permanent defenses. Ultimately, Ukraine's success came down to a few factors. One, Ukraine has managed to provide a much more effective cover and pressure via artillery fire in Kursk. The strikes focused on key military fortifications and infrastructure that could be used to reinforce the area with more troops. Satellite images of the region showed a few bridges and vital roads being destroyed throughout the region, effectively cutting the Russian army off from the mainland. Second, Russia has vastly overestimated the effectiveness of its ground forces in the area. As a result, most of the troops stationed throughout the Kursk region ended up being fresh recruits who have only had several weeks of combat training and were not exactly meant to fight on the front lines. What ended up happening with the new troops was a wave of Russians surrendering as the Ukrainian army advanced from one village to the next. Within the first week of the invasion, a Ukrainian prison that was housing prisoners of war reported processing 300 captured Russian soldiers, more than 80% of whom were newer conscripts. According to some estimates, the actual count of the prisoners could inflate by several hundred in mere weeks. Russia has also heavily underplayed the importance and the extent of the Kursk region. The initial reports made by the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested that the invading army had only 300 soldiers. The subsequent report even went so far as to proclaim that the Ukrainian troops were being actively pushed back by the local troops. This was a bold-faced lie to cover up the utter failure of the Russian war machine to account for the mere possibility that Ukraine was suddenly gaining ground. Soon after, more accurate reports by the Ukrainian and Western intelligence came in with surveys of the actual damage dealt in the Kursk region. They suggested that the invasion has caused between 120,000 and 200,000 residents of the area to become displaced, with Ukraine managed to occupy dozens of villages and slowly advance toward the administrative center of Kursk. 3 weeks after the incursion, the Russian response is still uncertain. For the most part, Russia continues to downplay the effect of the Kursk incursion on the actual progress of the war. The country's artillery has managed to slow down the Ukrainian forces and has thus far prevented them from going deeper into enemy territory. On the other hand, Russia has also scrambled to create trenches roughly 25 miles into the occupied territory. These trenches don't seem like they're going to be used as defensive positions by the Russians, though. Based on Russian actions so far and the state of the military in the region, it's likely that Ukraine can take control of these trenches and use them as stopgaps in a prolonged counter-invasion of Russia. On the other hand, Russia has reinvigorated its efforts on the Eastern Front. Reports from the last 2 weeks of August 2024 suggested that Russian forces have come as close as 7 miles to the city of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian government has urged the residents of the city to evacuate, but has encountered significant issues with moving large numbers of civilians so close to the renewed front lines. The reason for that is Russia's complete lack of care for Ukrainian civilians. Even before the newest waves of fighting, the Russian army has displayed utter ruthlessness when it comes to dealing with civilians. Throughout the war, Russia has frequently targeted primarily civilian areas with missiles and drones, forcing the Ukrainian military to heavily invest and ask for anti-air defensive systems, such as the US-made Patriots. The Russian airstrikes were focusing on Ukrainian hospitals, which housed both civilian and military casualties, an act which is against the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. In contrast, the Ukrainian army has made efforts to minimize civilian casualties in Kursk, working alongside international humanitarian organizations to provide aid to the people who remained in the area. The reinforcements and infrastructure that were struck by the Ukrainian airstrikes primarily had a military use, preventing Russia from reinforcing the region. Furthermore, Ukraine has shown no long-term goals to control the area it occupied during the Kursk incursion, at least according to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. This is unlike Russia's persistent efforts to annex parts of Ukraine, trying to claim the Donetsk region. President Zelensky has suggested that he's ready to present a plan to the US that outlines the terms of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The invasion of Kursk is therefore meant to drive down the narrative that Ukraine is not yet ready to yield to Russia and will continue to go on the offensive. By doing so, Ukraine can get a significant edge over Russia. First, the extent of the invasion in Kursk showcases how much Ukraine can accomplish in a relatively short time with restricted access to Western resources. While Russia has managed to occupy roughly 400 square miles of Ukrainian land between January and July 2024, Ukraine currently holds some 500 square miles of the Kursk Oblast territory, all acquired within the span of 3 weeks. This gives Zelensky the confidence to ask for more resources, particularly long-range missiles, fighter jets and artillery, which would allow Ukraine to press deeper into Russia by advancing on the newly made Kursk front. This will allow Ukraine to force Russia to back away from the Eastern Front and rethink whether Kursk is an unimportant part of the wider war. Additionally, the recent allotment of aid primarily comes in the form of ammunition and anti-air missiles, which have seen consistently positive results on the Eastern Front throughout the Kursk invasion. One of the most recent Russian attacks on the Eastern Front has been a devastating airstrike with 127 missiles and 109 drones launched, according to an Al Jazeera report. Ukraine's air defenses have managed to take out 102 missiles and 99 drones, heavily reducing the damage Russia could inflict on Ukrainian military compounds, infrastructure, and even civilian areas. Russia has been getting bolder in what it terms acceptable military targets, with one drone hitting a dam only miles upstream from Kyiv. The dam suffered minimal damage and remained intact, but it showcased that Russia will not relent until it completely dominates Ukraine. To that end, the current incursion of Kursk provides a twofold solution to this problem. First, Ukraine has started to ramp up its drone attacks as well, considering that the country has heavily invested in creating a domestic military drone industry and has received long-range missiles from NATO. The current effective range of the Ukrainian drones is estimated to be roughly 1,100 miles away from the Ukrainian border. By pushing further into Russian territory, Ukraine can create a favorable position to start launching more precision strikes directly at Moscow. Until now, Moscow has been relatively untouched by the conflict. The conscription efforts were disproportionately targeting rural areas, especially people who belong to Russia's many national minorities. A PBS News interview in 2023 suggested that 6 out of 10 regions with the highest death tolls were in Siberia and the Far East, and that men from certain minorities were as much as 75 times more likely to die from the war than Muscovites. In contrast, Moscow has seen a significant brain drain in the first months of the war, with around 900,000 Russians leaving the country by the end of 2022. Many of them were blue-collar, highly skilled workers, which has largely stripped the capital of people who view the war negatively. If Ukraine manages to put direct military pressure on Moscow and give the capital a feeling of what it's like to be in an active war, it's highly likely that the public sentiment on the war will change. Even in an authoritarian regime such as Putin's, this could lead to a significant ideological shift within the country that could spell doom for the nation's leadership and geopolitical relations. But let's go back to the second reason why Ukraine's Kursk invasion can solve its air defense problems. The army's ability to withstand hostile airstrikes while advancing in enemy territory gives Zelensky more sway to ask for direct military equipment from NATO countries, primarily in the form of Patriots and other anti-air defense systems. These can prove vital if Ukraine wants to maintain its momentum and pressure Russia without receiving air retaliation. And Ukraine has one more ace up its sleeve for aerial supremacy. The F-16s have arrived. After months of training, NATO's shipment of 65 F-16s has been deemed ready to take flight over Ukraine, piloted by Ukrainian fighter pilots. The F-16 is one of the most modern fighter jets available to both sides of the conflict. Russia has the Su-27s, which were specifically made to counter the threat of the F-16 but failed to do so. The addition of F-16s aims to degrade what little is left of Russia's hope to control Ukraine via its airspace. This is why Zelensky has also been adamant about asking for even more fighter jets to defend the country. The small victory that the Ukrainian army achieved in Kursk can be seen as a precursor and a catalyst of what can be done in the wider context of the war itself. But why is airspace control vital in turning the tide of war? The answer lies in Russia's saber-rattling. During 2022 and 23, NATO efforts to end the war by providing Ukraine with more advanced military equipment have been met with resistance from Russia. Putin has frequently alluded to the possibility that there's a line that NATO cannot cross, or it risks impeding on Russia's sovereignty, which is quite rich considering the goal of the special military operation. Russia has frequently used its reserve of nuclear weapons to prevent NATO from providing full support to Ukraine under the pretense that Ukraine would use the weapons to invade Russia in turn. While that moment has happened, Ukraine has managed to occupy a portion of Russia. The Russian response was to first deny the claims, then fabricate increasingly bold lies about the state of the invasion, followed by a half-hearted attempt at securing the Kursk region while also pressuring Ukraine on the existing Eastern Front. Therefore, it became even more unlikely that Russia will use nuclear weaponry against Ukraine and NATO. NATO's strategy so far has been to arm Ukraine just enough so it can prolong the war, but avoid crossing Russia's lines in the sand, so to speak. The Kursk incursion and lack of Russia's nuclear responses might just give NATO the go-ahead to approve more ambitious plans to provide more comprehensive aid to Ukraine. This means that Putin is losing all his leverage against the West, and that NATO can start putting more pressure to end the war in Ukraine's favor. But there's yet another factor to consider when discussing the current war events: economies. Both Russia and Ukraine have had to heavily change how their economies function in wartime. Ukraine is using nearly $350 billion worth of financial and military equipment aid from Europe and the US to keep itself running. More specifically, the country had previously suffered greatly from Russia being able to control the Black Sea with its navy, a military force that Ukraine is sorely lacking in. However, Ukraine managed to score yet another significant victory on that front, mainly via drone warfare. Starting with the spring of 2022, Ukraine has made several attempts to create drones that were specifically made for sea-to-sea warfare. The sea-deployed Magura V5 drone was designed to deliver an explosive payload by swimming rather than flying. The first public showcases of the Magura V5s were made later in the year, damaged Russia's newest Black Sea Fleet flagship and a minesweeper. Emboldened by the success, Ukrainians began to use the drones more offensively and supported their sea-based attacks with traditional air-to-surface strikes deeper into Russia's territory to cut off access to the Black Sea. The result was 26 sunk or damaged ships in the Russian fleet, forcing Russia to withdraw from Sevastopol in October 2023. This allowed Ukraine to reopen some of its previous maritime trading routes and start exporting across the Black Sea. By August 2024, Ukrainska Pravda reported that the reopened Black Sea corridor had been used by 2,300 ships over the past year, and that grain exports were slowly starting to reach pre-war numbers. This effectively means the country doesn't solely need to rely on financial aid to get its economy up and running. In contrast, Russia's economy has become more isolationist than ever. In response to the invasion, the EU has stopped Russia's oil and gas exports. In response, Russia has been forced to find new clients, namely China and India. But the deal with China comes with significant caveats. The price of natural gas was purported to be roughly half of what Russia was achieving on the Western market, limiting its options to create income from selling natural resources. The US has also posed significant economic sanctions on Russia, preventing the country from trading in US dollars or obtaining any technology or equipment that could be construed as being used militarily. The short-term effect of the sweeping trade changes was that China and Russia achieved record trade volume in 2023 at over $240 billion. However, even that doesn't seem like it'll work out in Russia's favor in the long run. While the total trade has managed to grow slightly, the oil trade has actually seen a decline in 2024 so far compared to 2023, and the prices are unstable. Furthermore, Russia's economy has evidently gone all in on supplying the war effort. The 2024 budget has allocated around 39% of the government funding to military and national defense, a staggering figure compared to the rest of the world. Russia has now one of the highest military spending figures, both in total and as a percentage of GDP, 6% compared to the US's 3.4%, China's 1.7%, and NATO's 2.7% average. This can be attributed to the country's blossoming energy sector, which is again a response to Russia's heavy reliance on exporting oil and natural gas. The energy sector has the potential to create an even greater imbalance in employment opportunities for Russian citizens. If the energy sector is more lucrative than, let's say, manufacturing or agriculture, Russia will see a significant shift in energy companies gaining employees at the expense of other industries. The newly minted middle and upper classes will create a demand for the service sector, which will again drain the less desirable industrial sectors. But the process can only continue as long as the energy sector continues to grow, and that growth isn't sustainable. Furthermore, the downfall of the other sectors will force Russia to depend on importing more and more from neighboring countries, typically China or the former Soviet nations like Kazakhstan and Belarus. Ultimately, this gives China far greater control of Russia's geopolitics than Putin might feel comfortable with. If China decides to pull the plug on Russian exports as a result of US pressure, Russia's economy might be facing a downturn, which will halt the country's militaristic ambitions. When the invasion started, and over the course of the following 2 years, Russia was hoping to use its resource advantage to drain Ukraine's resources and win by plowing over what was left of the country when the latter's military was annihilated. However, the recent events in Kursk have shown that Ukrainians have plenty of fight left in them, and that the world no longer has much to fear from Russia's nuclear arsenal. With Russia's military proving to be at an increasing disadvantage compared to Ukrainian troops bolstered by NATO, Russia's economy propped up by China and already past the point of no return, and Putin unable to manipulate NATO into standing down, Russia has pretty much run out of options. We might see that the closing months of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 become the effective end of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If that happens, Putin is unlikely to have much ground to make demands for peace will be enforced on Russia, and it might spell doom for Russia as a country itself. But what do you think? Does the Kursk invasion of Russia mean that Ukraine is on a quick path to victory, or will the war continue for a few more years? It has been dubbed the largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine so far. On August 26, 2024, while still licking his wounds following the humiliation of the Kursk invasion, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a concentrated missile and drone attack that struck several cities in Ukraine. ABC News called it a nightmare strike that targeted 15 regions in the country, with Russia launching at least 127 missiles and 109 drones during an 8-hour attack. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky labeled the attack dastardly, while pointing out that Russia was once again using its missiles and drones to hit civilian infrastructure. By the end of the strike, at least 7 people were dead and another 47 injured, with 4 of those 47 being children, according to Ukraine's state emergency service. Still, it could have all been so much worse. The reason it wasn't is that Ukraine was able to defend against this missile and drone attack, not only with the air defense systems it's used since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, but with a weapons platform that Zelensky has long said Ukraine needed. A weapons system that's capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky and over time may help to put Ukraine on a more even footing with Russia in the aerial battle. We're talking about the F-16. As well as being the day in which Russia launched its largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine, August 26th also marked the first time that Ukraine used F-16s to fight against Russia. In this video, we're going to provide a full analysis of how Ukraine used its new multi-role fighters, what its plans for the F-16s are likely to be in the future, and the challenges it still faces in establishing any form of aerial superiority over Russia. But first, a recap. Since the beginning of the war, Zelensky has argued that American-made F-16s could play a huge role in helping Ukraine turn the tide. The planes, he believed, would allow Ukraine to create small pockets of air superiority over Russia's enemy, particularly when used as part of combined ground operations, as Ukraine attempts to seize back territory Russia had snatched from it. But Zelensky was made to wait, and wait. In July 2023, several countries, including Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands, formed a fighter jet coalition through which they pledged to deliver 85 F-16s to Ukraine. That might give you the impression that Ukraine received these fighter jets in 2023, but that wasn't the case. Before those planes could be sent to Ukraine, its pilots needed to undergo an extensive training program to learn how to use them. After all, these are pilots who have traditionally used older Soviet-era platforms, such as the MiG-29, and it would take them months to get up to speed on the F-16. The American multi-role fighter traditionally has a training program that lasts for 18 months. Even with that training being fast-tracked into a 6-month program, it would still be a long time after the coalition commitment was made before the F-16s would arrive in Ukraine. "It's been 18 months and the planes have not reached us," Zelensky proclaimed in July 2024, adding that he believed having F-16s would help Ukraine to unblock the skies over his country. The good news for Zelensky was that he wouldn't have to wait much longer to get his hands on F-16s. On August 4, 2024, Zelensky stood at an unnamed airbase in Ukraine, flanked by 2 of the first batch of 6 F-16s the country had received. "F-16s in Ukraine, we did it," he said during the ceremony, in which he thanked the coalition leaders who had made this possible while stressing that Ukraine would need many more. Those extra F-16s will come. It's believed Ukraine will have received 20 of them by the end of 2024, with another 65 waiting in the wings. But these first 6 will go some way to boosting Ukraine's air force so it can move away from the old Soviet systems upon which it's been forced to rely. Fast forward a little over 3 weeks and we arrive at August 26th and Russia's nightmare missile and drone attack. It was time for the F-16s to show what they could do. Sandbox News provided details about how Ukraine is using its F-16s in its August 27th report on Russia's missile and drone strike. It noted that of the 127 missiles and 109 drones that Russia sent to Ukraine, the vast majority were intercepted or shot down before they reached their targets. Ultimately, 102 Russian missiles were downed, along with 99 of the 109 drones. Ukrainian anti-air defenses were credited with the majority of these interceptions, but Sandbox claims that reports were coming in that Ukraine had deployed its F-16s for the first time, with those multi-role fighters taking part in a defensive effort that saw them shoot down several cruise missiles that were on their way to Kyiv and other locations. From there, the report became more speculative. Sandbox revealed that it wasn't known how many of its F-16s Ukraine had deployed in this defensive role, or exactly what types of missiles the planes had shot down. It notes that it's very unlikely that the F-16s were used to take out ballistic missiles, such as the Iskander-M, as their flight profiles make them difficult for the F-16 to counter. Instead, Sandbox says, it's much more likely that these F-16s played a part in taking down the bevy of surface and air-launched cruise missiles that Russia threw into Ukraine. It points to the Russian Kh-101 and K-59. both of which it says operates more like tactical aircraft than ballistic missiles when they're in the sky. These missiles are powered by jet engines, similar to those used in older jets, giving them a heat signature for the F-16's missile systems to track. Because of those jet engines, the missiles also fly at lower altitudes and take a more horizontal flight path than ballistic missiles. However, the fact that they top out at speeds of between 600 and 700 miles per hour means they have no real means of defending themselves against a fighter jet that can fly faster and track them via their engines. Add to this that Ukraine has already revealed that the F-16s they've been showing off were seemingly loaded with air-to-air munitions, such as AIM-120B missiles and Sidewinder missiles capable of using infrared targeting, and it's clear that Ukraine intended to use its new planes as air defense assets. That's precisely what it appears to have done during Russia's extensive missile and drone attack, with the F-16s being used to take out cruise missiles, while Ukraine's other ground-based anti-air defenses focused on the ballistic missiles and drones. Sandbox says it's most likely that Ukraine was using AIM-9M Sidewinders, which have a range of around 10 miles, meaning any plane firing them would have to get up close and personal with a target. Given that F-16s can fly at speeds of up to 1,345 miles per hour, as well as reaching cruising speeds of 577 miles per hour, it's very feasible that Ukraine used them to track, catch, and then obliterate these types of Russian cruise missiles Sandbox notes were used in the attack. It's even possible, though perhaps unlikely, that Ukraine took advantage of the M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon built into the F-16. These 6-barrel cannons can rattle off an impressive 7,200 rounds per minute, with the caveat being that they're only really effective when the F-16 is within 2,000 feet of its target. They may have been used, though they would have required a pilot to get very close to a cruise missile, creating the risk of a debris cloud upon contact that could damage the F-16. Still, from all of this, we gain some insight into how Ukraine is using its F-16s. This initial batch, at least, appears to be a supplement to the country's aerial defenses. The F-16s weren't deployed on or behind the front lines and have yet to be used by Ukraine in combined efforts with ground-based soldiers. Instead, they're taking out missiles intended for targets on the ground in Ukraine, with their likely focus being to take out cruise missiles that Ukraine's ground-based anti-air systems can't track. A second missile and drone attack, launched just 2 days after the Nightmare attack, offered more insight. Sadly, it also showed just how much risk an F-16 pilot takes whenever they climb into the cockpit. According to a report by the Task and Purpose YouTube channel, Russia launched a second missile volley at Ukraine on August 29th. This one wasn't as large as the Nightmare attack, as it involved just 5 missiles and 74 drones fired at Ukrainian power generation facilities. However, Ukraine responded by sending an F-16 to take out as much as it could. That's when tragedy struck. The F-16 sent to take out the missiles and drones was piloted by Colonel Alexei Mess, who Politico says had long been a fervent advocate of delivering advanced fighter jets to Ukraine. On August 29th, Mess, who went by the handle Moonfish, was piloting one of those very jets during an aerial battle that saw him tackling the Russian missile and drone assault. He didn't make it. In a statement released by the Ukrainian Army General Staff, it was revealed that Moonfish had enjoyed some early success against the Russian missiles, shooting down 4 of them using his F-16's airborne weapons. Following that success, Moonfish, who was one of the first Ukrainian pilots to qualify to fly an F-16, encountered difficulties. During the approach to the next target, contact with one of the aircraft was lost. As it turned out later, the plane crashed. The pilot died, read the statement. Ukraine has yet to confirm if Moonfish was shot down or whether it was issues related to pilot or mechanical errors that led to his F-16 crashing. Whatever the case may be, the sad fact for Ukraine is that it's lost both a good pilot and one of the 6 F-16s it's received in the initial delivery, leaving it with just 5 until the next batch comes along. It was a difficult incident for the country, though it came tinged with a minor success. Moonfish had managed to destroy 3 attack missiles and 1 attack drone before his plane crashed. When combined with the much greater success achieved when dealing with the Nightmare strike that came 2 days prior, it's clear Ukraine is starting to figure out how to use its F-16s to turn the tide of battle against Russia. All of which brings us to a key question. What have we learned so far? Speaking to the Ward Carroll YouTube channel, Professor Justin Bronk, a senior research fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, says that these early engagements show Ukraine is taking a cautious early approach with its F-16s. So far, we're not seeing a huge amount of what the Ukrainians are doing with the F-16, which in many ways is quite encouraging. It suggests they're being fairly cautious with them. It suggests that they're probably concentrating on working out and practicing the dispersed operation model, said Bronk. This early caution is smart on Ukraine's part, as it means it's tempering the elation of finally having F-16s with the reality that only had 6 of them as of the creation of this video. So it's deploying them in a limited defensive manner. There are no confirmed uses of the F-16 near the front lines, which Bronk points out is a far more dangerous use. They're also not being used to support the Kursk invasion, meaning Ukraine is either still working on the best strategy for a more offensive deployment, or it's biding its time until more of the promised 85 F-16s arrive in the country. Of course, these early engagements aren't risk-free, as we saw with Moonfish, but Ukraine choosing not to use its F-16s on the front lines right now means it believes the jets are best used in isolated engagements, which brings us to their current air defense role. Task and Purpose points out that the F-16 Ukraine lost wasn't flying near Kursk, and it wasn't lost near the borders where active fighting is taking place on the ground. This shows that the early assessments of their usage are correct, with Ukraine preferring to use its F-16s in an air defense role, meaning they will likely play the part of interceptors for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, the same channel also points out a side benefit of this interception strategy. Noting that there are only so many interceptor missiles to go around in Ukraine, Task and Purpose says that F-16s can more easily take out missiles and drones thanks to their advanced sensors, which frees up a lot of the older platforms to tackle riskier missions near the front lines. It sounds counterintuitive, but there's also a logic to this approach. Ukraine's pilots are far more experienced in flying Soviet-era jets that make up the majority of its air force. They know how to get the most out of them, says Task and Purpose, meaning Ukraine can use them to offer close air support to ground troops and conduct harassment missions, while the F-16 patrols the skies over Ukraine, ready to intercept any incoming missiles and drones. This approach also enables some level of training. After all, Ukraine's current F-16 pilots have only undergone around 6 months of training for a platform that usually requires 18 to master. By taking the more cautious approach of using F-16s as missile interceptors, Ukraine's pilots can cut their teeth on less dangerous targets, according to Task and Purpose. Perhaps the strategy is to gain greater familiarity with the platform in the short term, which will enable Ukraine's pilots to use F-16s in riskier frontline missions once the country has received more of its promised stock. That future looks brighter too, thanks to the F-16 opening up a whole new arsenal of weapons for Ukraine to use. Task and Purpose note that having Western jets at its disposal means that Ukraine now has access to the advanced weaponry developed by NATO that it previously was only able to jerry-rig into its Soviet-era jets. The channel points out that Ukraine's jets were forced to use R-60 infrared missiles and R-27 semi-active missiles during the early stages of the war, as those were all that were available, as well as being the only types of missiles the jets could use. Both missiles were developed in the 1980s, making them around 40 years out of date, and they resulted in Ukrainian pilots not having long-range capabilities. Compare that with Russian pilots who are using R-77 active radar missiles, and you see why this is so important. The R-77 has fire-and-forget capabilities, meaning the pilot can pull the trigger on the missile and then move away as the missile tracks its target. Ukraine's missiles required its pilots to keep the noses of their planes pointed at their targets, meaning they couldn't pull away to evade fire. That's all changed with the arrival of the F-16. The jet is capable of firing the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, which offers both fire-and-forget and beyond visual range capabilities, with many calling it one of the best active radar missiles in the world. It has a range of over 20 miles and can move at supersonic speeds before delivering a blast fragmentation warhead to a target. With missiles like these, Ukraine doesn't just achieve parity with the weapon systems used in Russian jets, it exceeds them. As more F-16s arrive in Ukraine, it's likely that we will see more of the jets making their way to the front lines to more directly engage Russian jets in the skies. That could change the entire complexion of the war, as F-16s could tackle the planes Russia is using to launch glide bombs and take out targets on the ground to enable advances by Ukrainian soldiers. However, that type of strategy is likely being reserved for the future, when Ukraine is more capable of unleashing the full potential of its F-16s. For now, it's going down a more defensive route, which brings us back to Ukraine's current usage of the F-16 as an interceptor. It's been making the jet even more capable of carrying out its role by implementing new defensive systems. Task and Purpose examined the F-16s that were on display during Zelensky's August 4th announcement of their arrival and noticed that they had new pieces of kit installed beyond their missile systems. An examination of the jet's pylons revealed that some of them look bulkier than they should, with one even looking like it had small vents and a camera lens installed. That's the combination of pylon-integrated dispensing systems and electronic combat-integrated pylon systems, Task and Purpose said, adding that they are additional defensive models created to improve the F-16's survivability. With these systems, Ukraine's F-16s can use jammers capable of spoofing the radar signals enemy missiles produce, preventing them from locking onto their fighter jet while it's in the air. The systems are even powerful enough to confuse ground-based anti-air systems, as well as larger aircraft. Add an AAR-60 missile warning system to those pylons, which uses ultraviolet light to detect the exhaust plume an incoming missile produces, and you have extensive defensive capabilities. Those capabilities will prove essential as Ukraine continues to use F-16s in an interception capacity. They'll also prove vital should Ukraine ever send its F-16s into direct combat with Russian fighters on the front lines. By now we're getting a clearer picture of the Ukrainian strategy. It's using F-16s to intercept missiles and drones for now, all while preparing its pilots for a future in which it has more of those aerial platforms available, which may allow it to run more advanced operations closer to the front. Even if that future doesn't come to pass, the use of F-16s may free up Ukraine's Soviet-era aircraft to operate on the front lines in safe knowledge that the F-16s are protecting key Ukrainian military installations. And there's more. Returning to Justin Bronk's conversation with Wade Carroll, Bronk says that Ukraine has been attacking Russian air bases with large missile salvos already. By bringing F-16s into those strikes, Ukraine develops a greater chance for success, which will put more pressure on Russia to evacuate its air bases, relieving pressure on Ukraine in the process. Ukraine can potentially try and blend missile and HIMARS attacks to create this pressure, Bronk claims, which will result in Russia pulling more of its jets further back. Not only does this lower the risk of Russia sending glide bombs and its own jets into Ukraine, but it also creates space for Ukraine's F-16s to operate on the front lines with less risk of encountering Russian fighters. Even if Russia goes down the opposite path and creates layered defenses at its air bases near the front lines, Bronk claims, that will mean offering less defensive capacity to troops and installations that are actually on those front lines. Again, that would create opportunities for Ukraine's F-16s, allowing them to operate at lower risk as they'll face fewer defenses. This creates a win-win situation for Ukraine. Risk is lowered either because Russia is pulling back, which also helps Ukraine's ground troops, or it's lowered because Russia's front-line defenses are sent to its air bases, giving the F-16s more room to operate. Again, this is likely a strategy for the future. Ukraine will need to receive more than the number of F-16s promised to it to make this pressure tell. All of that brings us to the ultimate goal Ukraine wants to achieve with its F-16s, preventing Russia from gaining or retaining air superiority. As faltering as Russia's efforts to gain this superiority have been, given that it's lost 368 planes and 328 helicopters already, it's at least been able to rely on its aerial might from behind the front lines. Glide bombs are launched from bases Ukraine can't reach, for instance, allowing Russia to rain explosives down on Ukrainian targets with little recourse. Brock says the foreseeable future of Ukraine's F-16 strategy is not to gain air superiority, it's to prevent Russia from gaining air superiority. With Brock noting that even with its full fleet of F-16s, Ukraine will still be facing a Russia that has a fleet somewhere in the region of 350 genuinely modern and capable fast jets that are individually at a technical level significantly more capable than the F-16 in most metrics. So Ukraine's goal is to be capable of defending its skies rather than using its F-16s to operate with impunity over the front lines. That's an achievable goal that, if Ukraine realizes it, will relieve the pressure placed on its key military installations and troops on the ground. With his aerial options restricted, Putin will be forced to either waste more of his missiles and drones on strikes, cutting into his already dwindling supplies, or simply send more soldiers into a war that's already cost Russia over 630,000 military personnel. In the end, it's about imposing cost, argues Bronk. That's seen in the Kursk invasion and the long-range missile and drone strikes Ukraine has used against Russian energy facilities and its Black Sea fleet. Ukraine's new F-16s are likely going to become an extension of that strategy. They'll cost Russia valuable missiles, while helping Ukraine simply not lose the war long enough for its other strategies to really add up, to the point where Putin may have to pull out based on cost alone. Still, there's one thing that's being underestimated when it comes to Ukraine's use of the F-16. The impending arrival of the Saab 340 aircraft. In May 2024, Sweden announced that it would donate 2 of its Saab 340s to Ukraine, in a move that flew somewhat under the radar. With all the hubbub about Ukraine receiving F-16s, Task and Purpose suggests that the arrival of these planes could be a real force multiplier in terms of how Ukraine is able to leverage its F-16s. Why? Because it's a radar aircraft that's capable of spotting incoming threats before the F-16 systems can locate them. An F-16 without being backed up by this type of radar aircraft is like shooting a rifle without an ACOG or Advanced Combat Optical Gunsight scope, says the channel. The Saab 340 will serve as that scope. Though it's essentially a twin turboprop plane, the Saab 340 comes with a high-tech radar system and the ability to communicate the data it retrieves directly to an F-16 in the field. So the Saab 340 will track incoming missiles and similar threats at extremely far distances, allowing it to send tracking data to the F-16s so they can eliminate the threat. The arrival of the Saab 340 will reinforce Ukraine's use of the F-16 as an interceptor, making it far more effective than it currently is. And that, more than anything else, can make Ukraine's F-16 capable of turning the tide of the Ukraine war. With Saab 340s at their sides, Ukraine's F-16s become cruise and ballistic missile destroying machines, creating enormous costs for the Russian military while making their future missile strikes less effective. Perhaps that's why the Russian company Forez, likely under advice from Putin, is offering a 15 million ruble reward to the first soldier who manages to shoot down an F-16. That bounty, which amounts to about $170,000, is a sure sign that Putin needs Ukraine's F-16s out of the sky so he can continue his special military operation in the way he envisions it. Of course, there are still challenges ahead for Ukraine. The 6 F-16s it's received so far, or rather 5 now that one crashed, are far from enough to allow Ukraine to establish air superiority. They also aren't enough for Ukraine to fully realize its defensive strategy, meaning Ukraine can't start sending its Soviet-era fighters to the front lines yet. There's also the training issue to confront. 6 months of training has made Ukraine's pilots capable, but they're not at the stage where they can get the most out of the F-16 systems yet. Flying defensive missions, which are relatively low risk compared to frontline sorties, can boost flight hours, but there's still a clear skill gap that needs to be filled. It's also worth pointing out that Ukraine doesn't have access to the most modern weapons the F-16 can use. The US and NATO may not want to risk the most advanced weapons providing an intelligence coup for potential adversaries, claims Task and Purpose, while pointing out that Russia may be able to reverse engineer anything that it captures from crashed F-16s. There's still plenty of good news for Ukraine to take away from its first use of the F-16. It knows the jets are capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky, and that its pilots are well trained enough to make use of the planes. More flight hours will only build on this training, opening up further options in the future upon the arrival of the Saab 340s and the rest of the promised F-16 stock. And if Ukraine can maintain as many of its F-16s as possible, it's going to be able to use them to chip away at Russia's aerial and missile forces, as well as potentially offer support to its ground troops to drag Russia even deeper into a war of attrition that's already cost Putin and his military heavily. The F-16s aren't going to turn the tide of the war alone, but Ukraine's clever usage of them so far suggests that they'll become a vital piece of the Ukraine war puzzle, that when combined with Ukraine's other cost-creating strategies, will put and keep Putin on his back foot until he's forced to negotiate. What do you think about the arrival of the F-16s in Ukraine? Has Ukraine used them effectively so far, and do you think it will change up or build on its current strategies once more of these multi-role fighters arrive?
Russia is a country at war. Hearing this sentence, your natural instinct will probably be to think of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which has escalated into the largest European conflict since World War II. But what if we told you that another war rages quietly within Russia's own borders, almost as long as the conflict with Ukraine itself? That's right, Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine, it's also fighting itself. In one corner, the entrenched elite, struggling to maintain their grip on a fractured empire. In another, a rising wave of discontent and resistance, challenging the very foundations of that empire. While this war isn't one of headlines and grand military maneuvers, it's just as consequential for the future of the Russian nation, if not more. This is the story of Russia's silent civil war. When it comes to inter-country wars, the situation is pretty clear-cut. There's usually a well-defined cause, straightforward objective, generally understood rules of engagement, and easily identifiable enemies. The battles are fought with weapons, and the outcomes are measured by territorial gains and losses, as well as direct battle deaths. In a civil war, on the other hand, all rules and boundaries are blurred. That's what makes each civil war a unique phenomenon. Still, some common elements often emerge, even amidst the chaos. In most civil wars, there's some kind of prior conflict, a simmering issue that's gradually escalated. This can be a historical grievance, as was the case with the American Civil War, long-standing political corruption like the one fueling the Syrian War, or deep social and economic inequalities that have been suppressed but never fully addressed, which led to some major bloodshed in conflicts like the Rwandan Civil War. Russia's silent civil war is unique in this regard, as the prior conflict in question is an external one, the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Russia's military engagement with Ukraine has had profound internal repercussions, creating growing divisions within the country itself. But why? Isn't the invasion of Ukraine just a special military operation aiming to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as Russia's President Vladimir Putin put it? Of course not. As soon as Kyiv didn't immediately fall when faced with 190,000 Russian troops and tens of thousands of its vehicles, the so-called special operation became a very real war. A war that fought to strip a democratic country of its very statehood and its people of their identity. But as much as Putin tried to spout a narrative about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, calling them one people, the harsh reality was far different. So the Russian people soon started to catch on. It's not about liberation, it's about domination. And so Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 pushed forward a long-standing decline, one that has been underway for 20 years, in democratic freedoms, media autonomy, and civil society at home. In the words of Konstantin Eggert, an exiled Russian journalist, the war in Ukraine finally allowed Putin and his crowd to introduce a uniform ideology in Russia, which they always dreamt of introducing, but they couldn't do it because they were supposed to play democracy. Sure, this supposed democracy has always been somewhat of a facade, but as the Russian author Grigory Kartashvili, who goes by the pen name Boris Akunin, puts it, Russia was a troubled, chaotic democracy, an interesting country where a lot of things were happening. Now it's become totally Kafkaesque, Orwellian. And in such an autocratic regime, a civil war is almost inevitable, especially considering how poorly the Russian government treats its people. On the one hand, there are soldiers fighting in Ukraine whose role in this war can be best summed up in two words: cannon fodder. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as many as 592,000 Russian troops have either been killed or injured, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. That's 10 times more than the total number of casualties of the Soviet Union's decade-long invasion of Afghanistan. Add the thousands of people missing or left behind in Ukraine, and it becomes clear that the human cost of Putin's brutal war is staggering. But how is this possible? Sure, the Ukrainians have been fighting fearlessly, beyond what many could have imagined. They're also supported by Western allies, with the US alone donating over $40 billion in military aid until February 29, 2024. However, the main reason Russia is suffering such heavy losses is Russia itself. Since the invasion started, the Kremlin made one reckless decision after another. First, it was the so-called partial mobilization of the Russian reservists in the fall of 2022, when 300,000 people were forced to join the army, clearly showing how bad the invasion was going only 7 months in. Vice News, a long-form news content unit with the Canadian-American media outlet Vice, visited a Russian theater-turned-draft center, processing some 100 recruits a day to gauge the reaction of those being conscripted. The conscription itself was never the problem. After all, in times of war, mobilizing additional troops is a common practice. The real issue lay in the execution and the underlying conditions that accompanied this mobilization. To start, the soldiers were only given 24 hours to report for duty, a stark contrast to the usual 3 days they previously received to say goodbye to their loved ones. In this scenario, conscripts living in a different city didn't even have a chance to kiss their parents goodbye. And even if their families managed to reach the draft center in time to say goodbye, they were only given 3 minutes to do so. 3 minutes to convey the gravity of their departure, share heartfelt words, and offer an embrace, all while fearing that it might be the last one ever. Still, many conscripts only spoke highly of their duty, either out of true blind faith or fear to speak critically of the war, which has since become a criminal offense. Alexei, a young conscript soldier interviewed by Vice, shared that he felt proud of his country and the fact he didn't shun his duty. He added he was ready to defend his motherland, not doubting for a second that it would emerge victorious. When asked whether he was willing to give his life for his motherland, his answer was affirmative, emphasizing that pride and courage are the most important things. If the Kremlin appropriately rewarded Alexei and others like him, these strong patriotic sentiments might have been sustained or even amplified. But what the Kremlin did instead was send the fresh recruits into battle with poor training, poor equipment, and worst of all, poor leadership. So video after video started emerging from the Ukrainian battlefield. New soldiers carrying rusty rifles, fresh recruits bringing their own makeshift medical kits, units sent to the front line within days of entering Ukraine despite having no formal training, commanders being drunk while their men died. Even getting badly injured in the war didn't guarantee better treatment. Most of the injured soldiers didn't receive proper therapy, and some of them were sent back to the front lines to fight. They were adding insult to literal injury. Given the horrifying reports coming from Ukraine, it shouldn't be surprising that many veterans deemed this war significantly worse than Chechnya, Georgia, or any other conflict modern Russia took part in. It also shouldn't be surprising that the war in Ukraine dealt a massive blow to the patriotism of even the most ardent supporters of the Kremlin. After all, when their country needed help, they stepped up. Yet they were only rewarded with an unrelenting cycle of disappointment and suffering. The more the abysmal treatment of the Russian soldiers became public, the worse the reactions to it got. At first, thousands of Russians fled the country to escape suffering the same fate, but then protests erupted. Military recruitment centers were set on fire. A conscription officer was even shot in Siberia. One would think that these alarming reactions would be a wake-up call for the Kremlin, but that person would be oh so terribly wrong. The Kremlin only doubled down on its repressive measures, awarding undeserving generals with medals while feeding the soldiers to the meat grinder. The government also intensified its crackdown on dissent, implemented stricter laws, and tightened control over information. In a grim display of authoritarianism, the regime pursued harsh penalties for those caught protesting in any way, squashing any trace of freedom of expression. The deepening repression underscored a regime more concerned with maintaining its grip on power than addressing the genuine grievances and dire conditions facing its people. Some 30 years ago, cases of treason were quite rare in Russia. Now anyone could be declared a traitor, be it a foreigner or a Russian citizen. In 2023 alone, there were over 100 known treason cases in Russia, reminding us of many of the infamous show trials and purges of the Stalinist era. The trials of the Putin era all shared similar characteristics. They were held behind closed doors. The specific charges and evidence supposedly secured by Russia's Federal Security Service or FSB were always shrouded in secrecy. The trials always resulted in convictions and lengthy prison terms. Many of the traitors, spies, and saboteurs, as Putin labeled the barrage of alleged enemies of the state, simply found themselves on the wrong side of an increasingly paranoid regime. And so Ivan Safronov, an advisor to the Roscosmos space agency and former military affairs journalist, was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2022 for treason. Safronov denied these charges, insisting they were nothing but retaliation for his reporting on the military. Interestingly, his father, Ivan Ivanovich Safronov, also a journalist, died after falling from the 5th floor of his Moscow apartment building in 2007. Although his death was ruled a suicide, there were widespread suspicions that Ivan Ivanovich's death was not accidental. Many believed he was targeted for his investigative work, which often exposed sensitive military issues. The parallels between the father's mysterious death and the son's harsh sentencing were hard to ignore, leading to speculation that the Safronov family had long been under scrutiny by the state. Other notable figures who suffered a similar fate as the Safronov family include physicist Dmitry Kolka, arrested in a hospital where he was treated for advanced pancreatic cancer for supposedly revealing state secrets in his lectures in China. After being taken to Lefortovo prison, his family was told he had died in a hospital there, raising questions about the harsh treatment of terminally ill prisoners. Physicist Valery Golobkin, accused of similar charges and sentenced to 12 years, reflecting a pattern of targeting academics and scientists under the pretext of protecting state secrets. Physicist Anatoly Maslov, sentenced to 14 years for treason, adding to the growing fear among the scientific community in Russia as more researchers became ensnared in what many viewed as politically motivated prosecutions. Politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, sentenced to 25 years in prison for giving speeches critical of Russia in the West. Luckily, Kara-Murza was released on August 1, 2024, as part of the most extensive prisoner exchange between the US and Russia since the end of the Cold War. The Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich, sentenced to 16 years in prison on espionage charges. He was also one of 26 political prisoners released in the August 1st exchange. As a result of these horrifying persecutions, powerful voices standing up against Putin and his ruling elite are becoming a rarity. And who can blame them when speaking up can only get you in one of these three places: in prison, in exile, or 6 feet under. However, prominent Russian and foreign figures aren't the only ones Russia is waging a silent civil war against. The most horrific stories are coming from all corners of the country, where ordinary citizens are finding themselves ensnared in the Kremlin's web of repression. Sometimes for something as simple as holding a sign calling for peace, repeating a chant, and even reciting a poem. That's right, Artem Kamardin, a 33-year-old Russian amateur poet, was jailed and given a 7-year sentence for reciting a poem. But this was not before he was brutally beaten by Russian police, stripped naked, and ordered to ask for forgiveness on video, and even sexually assaulted with a metal bar. His fiancée, who was present for the brutal raid and later interviewed by Vice, was also threatened with sexual violence, with the Russian forces trying to glue her lips together to silence her screams. Similar horror stories have emerged from across the country, painting a chilling picture of the Russian state's systematic crackdown on dissent. These accounts reveal a regime that has abandoned any pretense of justice or humanity, instead resorting to sheer brutality to maintain control. According to an independent media and human rights defense group focused on Russia, OVD Info, over 260 people are currently serving jail terms for crimes related to taking an anti-war stance. This number is just a small fraction of the staggering 20,040 people who've been detained for the same reason since February 24, 2022. There have also been 622 cases of extrajudicial pressure for an anti-war stance, as well as 1,206 cases of pressure on media workers and journalists. Another figure of note is the 45 repressive laws introduced since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Most of these laws, 26 of them, deal with the so-called foreign cooperation and foreign agents. 10 of them target freedom of speech and expression, and 5 aim to regulate the internet. In some cases, sentences for the crimes committed under these laws are equal to those passed down for murder. As for the potential defendants under these laws, the list grows longer by the day, and virtually anyone can make the list. As OVD Info lawyer and analyst Daria Korolenko puts it, they will imprison old people, they will imprison people who have disabilities, they will imprison people with children and women with children. They just want everyone to be silent. So Evgenia Mayboroda, a 72-year-old woman from Russia's Rostov region, was jailed for 5.5 years in early 2023 for spreading false information about the Russian army on social media. The false information in question, an emotional video about the number of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine. All things considered, it shouldn't be surprising that one of the prominent individuals jailed for his words, Oleg Orlov, described Russia as sinking deeper and deeper into this darkness at an ever-quickening pace. And in this darkness, there's no room for accurate media reporting or democratic institutions, so the Kremlin has been on a mission to dismantle both, sending more clear messages that a Russian civil war is underway. As far as media goes, a severely damaged information space is nothing new for Russia. Every special operation, conducted by the state, Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, has been accompanied by a purge of the media space. However, this de facto military censorship has reached new heights after the invasion of Ukraine. The goal is clear: to irreversibly break the flow of independent information and ensure that only the Kremlin's narrative prevails. As a result, a new, alternate reality has been created by the Kremlin, one where the Kremlin is supported by the majority of people, where Russia is the liberator and Ukraine is the oppressor. The Ukrainian people are vile, fascist Nazis, committing genocide against the Russian people. Even Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president and a Jewish person, is a Nazi. These messages are plastered all over, on state-run TV channels, news bulletins, and nationwide billboards. As Korolenko puts it, the climate is fed by the mainstream media that everyone is a spy and a traitor, foreign agent. Everyone wants to destroy Russia, destroy your home. Besides utilizing the Russian people against the common enemy, these campaigns are also trying to persuade them to join the army voluntarily, often playing on male fragility. Do you want to be a hero, a true patriot, or a spineless coward? But you see, these tried-and-true methods of manipulation and propaganda aren't as effective today as they were in the Soviet era. Why? 2 words: the internet. Russia's youth, more connected than ever through social media and alternative news sources, are increasingly exposed to diverse perspectives and information. Unlike the Soviet era, when state-controlled media was the sole source of news, today's digital age allows for rapid dissemination of uncensored information and alternative viewpoints. So what does the Kremlin do? It focuses on the internet specifically, of course. The Kremlin is heavily investing in the Institute for Internet Development, or IID, whose goal is to essentially funnel nationalistic online content. In 2022, this organization received $163 million from the Russian state. In 2023, this figure rose to $217 million, while in 2024, it's expected to reach $282 million. All the online shows produced by the IRI are designed to reinforce the Kremlin's narrative and suppress dissenting views. These productions are aimed at saturating the digital landscape with state-approved content, trying to counteract the influence of independent and foreign media, which are desperately trying to show the Russian people the true cost of the war. Besides the internet, the only way people can find out what's truly happening in this information vacuum is through a series of somewhat unreliable Russian Telegram accounts. But many people don't need any official or unofficial sources of information to understand what's truly happening in their country. All they need to see is the increasing number of graves across the country, with families not even allowed to open coffins of their loved ones before burying them. Signs of unjust suffering are visible across Russia, so it's only a matter of time before the current silent civil war turns into a fully fledged uprising. This possibility is only further supported by the pace at which Russian people are losing trust in the legitimacy of government institutions and the rule of law in Russia. The 2024 Russian presidential elections are the perfect example of this. After 3 days of voting, Putin reportedly won over 88% of the vote, getting re-elected as president for an unprecedented fifth time. In another drastic step away from democracy, Putin made amendments to the Russian constitution in 2020 to allow him to remain in power, potentially until 2036, when he would be 84 years old. Although Putin's victory was a foregone conclusion before the first ballot was even cast, the sheer scale of electoral fraud and manipulation was still astounding. Ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, busing Putin supporters to vote multiple times at different locations, forcing people to vote at gunpoint. There was nothing subtle about the efforts to skew the results in Putin's favor. Of course, there were still protests against the inevitable outcome. Thousands of Russians agreed to vote at noon on Sunday, thus symbolically supporting the late pro-democracy activist Alexei Navalny, who endorsed the Noon Against Putin plan on social media before he died. Others showed their discontent by spoiling their ballots and writing Navalny's name on them. Speaking of Navalny, many believed his death to be the conclusive phase of the country's regression toward authoritarian rule. Once Navalny, Putin's most prominent critic, was killed in February 2024, there was no going back. As Akunin explains it, by killing Alexei Navalny, they lost the last chance of trying to pretend that they were decent, law-abiding. Violence has now become the central pillar of the Russian state, and no matter how the war in Ukraine ends, the trajectory of the Kremlin's authoritarian regime seems unalterable. As long as the Kremlin is fighting its own people, violence won't dissipate from Russia. With this in mind, a question instantly arises. Will this silent civil war grow into an all-out uprising? Quite possibly. Although the country's regime's brutal tactics are aimed at preventing this, they might just push the ordinary Russian people over the edge, thus having the opposite effect. After all, Russia was already on the brink of a fully fledged civil war in June of 2023. This is when the infamous Wagner Group rebellion took place, checking all the boxes for an impending civil war. A fragmentation of security forces, loyalty shifts, the rise of armed groups' activity, escalating civil unrest. Prior to the rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, a private military company whose fighters have taken part in brutal conflicts all over Africa and the Middle East, openly and publicly criticized the Russian leadership for their poor handling of the invasion and inadequate support for the troops. He reported news straight from the front lines, earning international recognition. While Prigozhin's true motives can be debated, one thing was for certain: he showed the true state of the Russian military and its leadership. He labeled the Russian parliament members as useless, saying they should be the ones to go to the front first. Prigozhin didn't mince his words when talking about the commanders of the Russian army too, proclaiming they should be sent to the front barefoot with just a submachine gun. He particularly taunted Russia's former Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, calling him lazy and blaming him for the unnecessary full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. According to Prigozhin, the invasion of Ukraine was launched because Shoigu and his oligarch friends became greedy for more Ukrainian territories, causing them to push the Russian military into a pointless war that took hundreds of thousands of their lives. Prigozhin's message was clear: the evil brought by the military leadership of the country must be stopped. So he set out to do just that. Insults and call-outs turned into a full-blown rebellion in June 2023, when Prigozhin and 25,000 of his Wagner Group forces launched an unprecedented armed insurrection against the Kremlin. They started by seizing Rostov-on-Don, a Russian city a couple of miles from the Ukrainian border. Prigozhin posted a video of himself in the courtyard of the Southern Military District headquarters in the city, dispelling any doubts about his intentions. Interestingly, even on the eve of this insurrection, Putin reportedly didn't believe that it would ever actually happen, showing just how disconnected he'd become from the internal dissent brewing within his ranks. His disbelief underscored a dangerous complacency, allowing the rebellion to gain momentum and catch the Kremlin off guard. The Wagner Group rebellion was characterized by a rapid and audacious march toward Moscow, Russia's capital, seizing some military and administrative installations along the way. The armored columns bound for Moscow consisted of 5,000 to 8,000 combatants with tanks, armored vehicles, anti-aircraft weaponry, and civilian trucks. According to reports, the closest the Wagner Group got to Moscow was some 59 miles south of the city, reaching the town of Kashira. However, the only visual confirmation places Prigozhin's troops in Krasnoye in northern Lipetsk Oblast, 210 miles south of Moscow. Regardless of how far the Wagner Group got, it was clear that the sudden rebellion severely rattled the Kremlin and exposed significant vulnerabilities within the Russian state. The Wagner Group's advance, even if it didn't quite reach Moscow, demonstrated the capacity for serious internal dissent and the potential for rapid and destabilizing action in war-torn Russia. After almost 2 full days of advances, Prigozhin accepted a deal with Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko to prevent bloodshed. The deal was for the Wagner Group to cease any advancement and return to the base in exchange for a guarantee of its safety. If you're wondering why Lukashenko was the one to broker the deal, it's because Putin refused to speak to Prigozhin, who he once saw as a powerful ally. Putin previously denounced Prigozhin, though not by name, stating, "Exorbitant ambitions and personal interests have led to treason." And by now you know how Putin responds to treason at the highest level. Exactly 2 months after the Wagner Group rebellion, Prigozhin's airplane en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg crashed, killing all 10 people inside, including Prigozhin and several senior Wagner members. Though there were some claims that the aircraft was shot down by Russian air defenses over Tver Oblast, Western intelligence believed that an explosion on board was the culprit. Either way, the man who so publicly defied Putin and challenged the Kremlin's authority was no more. In the year since, the Kremlin has effectively dismantled the Wagner Group, placing the ex-Wagner troops across the Russian state. The goal was to eliminate a single person in charge, thus neutralizing any potential resurgence of organized resistance. Although some observers believed the Wagner Group would be eliminated, this was never going to happen. For one, Russia can't afford to lose any more soldiers, especially those as well trained and experienced as the Wagner troops. According to the US National Security Council, as many as 50,000 Wagner mercenaries were fighting in Ukraine at one point, underscoring just how crucial they are for the war effort. But also, the Wagner Group has historically been incredibly important for the Russian state, both geopolitically and economically, making it an invaluable asset beyond the war in Ukraine. With the dismantling of the Wagner Group, it's safe to say that no potential Putin adversary is strong enough to consolidate power and challenge his grip on the Kremlin, for now at least. Given how fast Russia is fracturing into power blocks and how seemingly willing the Kremlin is to target its own people, the situation in Russia remains volatile, and that's the understatement of the century. But what do you think? Is Russia inevitably heading for a full-scale civil war once its citizens finally reach a breaking point and rise against the regime's oppressive tactics? Or will the Kremlin's heavy-handed control and strategic dispersal of dissenters prevent such a scenario from unfolding? We don't have enough weapons. That was the claim made by Russian President Vladimir Putin in June 2023 as he held a meeting with pro-war bloggers in the Kremlin. Putin told the assembled crowd that during the course of the special military operation, it's become clear that there are shortages of many things: precision-guided munitions, communications equipment, aircraft, drones, and so on. It was a startling admission by a man who very rarely shows weakness, and it may have set the stage for something that happened just over a year later. Russia signed a cooperative defense pact with North Korea. On June 19, 2024, Putin and North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, confirmed that they had signed a pact in which each promised to come to the other's aid if they were attacked. While this raised the alarm in the West over the likelihood that Russia will help North Korea to develop nuclear missiles and submarines, the wording of the pact is also important to consider. Throughout 2024, several Western nations have permitted Ukraine to use the weapons they supply in Russian territory. That brings us to a question: why would Russia make a deal with what may be the world's most isolated nation, both geopolitically and economically? The answer is that Putin has failed to solve the problems he highlighted during his June 2023 speech, as Russia is on track to run out of all its weapons in its war against Ukraine. Let's start with some of the most important weapons Russia has been using: artillery. The Ukraine war has been characterized in part by Russian bombardments of Ukrainian positions using thousands upon thousands of artillery shells. In 2022 alone, it's believed that Russia fired up to 11 million shells at Ukrainian positions. The numbers have decreased since then, with Forbes staff writer David Axe suggesting that Russia now believes it needs a further 3 million shells to defeat Ukraine in February 2024. It's unlikely to get them. And even if it does, they may not be enough to win the war in the face of Western support Ukraine has received throughout 2024. But more worrying for Russia is that needing 3 million shells in 2024 shows how far its stockpiles have fallen since a year in which it fired more than 3 times that amount. Russia's struggles with artillery became evident within the first year of the Ukraine war. In January 2023, CNN ran a report in which it claimed that Russia's artillery fire was down by as much as 75% in some regions of Ukraine. Applying that to the previous year's volley of 11 million shells, this would suggest that Russia had run so low on artillery ammunition that it would only manage to fire around 2.75 million shells in 2023, a number that's suspiciously close to the number of shells Forbes said Russia believed it needed in 2024. The report speculated on several reasons for this massive decrease, including Russia rationing the shells it has remaining, or the country simply switching tactically to rely less on shells and more on other weapons. It's likely the former. The same CNN report notes that one senior US military official pointed out that Russia was being forced to rely on 40-year-old shells to maintain its bombardments. That use of degraded ammunition, combined with Russia reaching out to North Korea and Iran even back at the beginning of 2023, all point to a country that's been running out of artillery shells less than a year into the war. It gets worse for Russia. Not only is it running out of shells, but it's also running low on the artillery it needs to fire them. That information, again from David Axe for Forbes, claimed in January 2024 that Russia's soldiers are quickly running out of howitzer barrels for their artillery. These barrels are typically usable for several thousand shots before the steel used to make them becomes so brittle that they can't withstand further firing. Normally, a country would replace these degraded barrels with new ones fresh off the production line. Russia hasn't been doing that. Instead, Axe claims Russia is pulling Cold War-era howitzers out of storage. Quoting open-source analyst Richard Vereka, Axe said that these old howitzers aren't being sent to the front lines, it's their barrels that are heading to Ukraine. Russia is stripping those barrels, which are old but lightly used, and using them to replace the worn ones in its more modern howitzers. That's a problem because these older howitzers have typically been mothballed in poorly maintained storage facilities. The steel in their barrels may not have degraded much due to overuse, but they will likely have felt the effects of oxidation and moisture exposure over the last 40 years. So Russia is trying to make up for a barrel shortfall by pulling from old supplies that aren't especially fit for war. All of this may seem strange given that there are also reports of Russia producing far more artillery shells. In March 2024, CNN put the number at 3 times more than that produced by the US and the rest of Europe, suggesting that Russia is replenishing its stockpiles. But even then, that heightened production means it's creating 250,000 shells per month, amounting to 3 million per year. That's enough to cover the amount Russia claims it needs to win the war, but far below the 11 million shells it fired during the first year of the war. Russian officials also claim that the country is firing 10,000 shells per day, which would amount to 3.65 million per year, 650,000 more than it's producing. It's these shortages that have forced Russia to rely on the few allies it has to provide artillery shells. For instance, February 2024 saw South Korean intelligence officials claim that North Korea sent 6,700 containers carrying either 3 million 152mm artillery shells or 500,000 122mm shells in exchange for food and other goods from Russia. Throw Putin and Kim's recent pact into the mix and it's clear that Russia is being forced to rely on other countries to keep its artillery firing as it struggles to align production with the number of shells it uses daily. It's not just artillery that Russia is struggling to source. Even ammunition for basic weapons has been a problem throughout the war. In December 2022, Reuters reported on a senior US official's claim that many of Russia's soldiers are being sent to the front with old ammo. They have drawn from their aging ammunition stockpile, the official claimed, which does indicate that they are willing to use that older ammunition, some of which was originally produced more than 40 years ago. Again, we see a reliance on Soviet-era stockpiles rather than the production of new bullets. These claims back anecdotal reports that come from a similar time in the war, such as a Business Insider article that quoted Russian soldiers as they explained their predicament. The soldiers claimed that Russia threw us out into the field like dogs following their brief basic training, before they went on to say that Russia sent them to war with AK-47s, though no ammunition to load into them. No radio, no ammo, and not a f***ing thing. No medical supplies either, one of the soldiers claimed. So it looks like Russia's ammunition situation is, at best, inconsistent. Some soldiers have modern rounds, some have none at all. As for those who have older rounds, they face the predicament of having rounds that may only be safe to fire if the cartridges have been stored somewhere cool, dry, and lacking in moisture. That can't be guaranteed, given how much of Russia's equipment was mothballed, raising the possibility of cartridge jams when firing. One official, quoted in a Reuters article published in February 2024, summed up the issue succinctly. Russia's domestic ammunition production capabilities are currently insufficient for meeting the needs of the Ukraine conflict. That faltering production affects everything from artillery shells and rockets to the bullets soldiers should be able to load into their rifles. Of course, a lack of ammunition isn't the only problem Russia's soldiers face on the front lines, and it's a problem that you could argue is balanced by Ukraine's own struggles with munition stockpiles. Perhaps far more worrying for Russia is that it's also running out of a key weapon it's been using to gain ground in Ukraine: tanks. Estimates vary on just how many tanks Russia has lost. The Kyiv Independent quoted the open-source investigative project Oryx in July 2024, placing the number of Russian tanks damaged or destroyed in Ukraine at 3,180. However, that figure comes with the caveat that Oryx's data comes from open sources, meaning that the losses are likely much higher. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance certainly suggests they are. It maintains a live tracker of Russian losses in Ukraine, leading to its claim that Russia has lost 8,344 tanks as of July 3, 2024. Still, even 8,000 lost tanks shouldn't be too much of a problem for Russia. Global Firepower, which ranks 145 nations' militaries annually based on over 60 data points, says that Russia still has 14,777 tanks, with 10,344 of those tanks being in a combat-ready state. That means it should have enough for another 2.5 years of war, right? Not necessarily. For a start, production isn't keeping pace with the losses. Once again, we cite David Axe of Forbes, who states that Russia is only producing between 500 and 600 tanks per year. Even if we take the lower figure of 3,180 tanks destroyed, that means Russia is losing more than 1,000 tanks annually against a production of around half that number. The country simply isn't building enough tanks to refill its stockpiles of those it's losing. There's a gap in play. And it's that gap that forces Russia to do precisely what it's doing with its artillery: rely on Soviet-era technology to increase its numbers. Speaking to Reuters, Henry Boyd, the International Institute for Strategic Studies or IISS's senior fellow, claims that Russia is breaking even when it comes to replacing its lost tanks. He estimates that it had put between 1,000 and 1,500 tanks into service in 2023, though there is a caveat. Only 200 of these tanks, at most, were newly built. The much larger majority are tanks that have been mothballed for years, with T-55s even making their way onto the battlefield. As Boyd puts it, Moscow has been able to trade quality for quantity by pulling thousands of older tanks out of storage at a rate that may, at times, have reached 90 tanks per month. Boyd estimates that Russia's older tank reserves could sustain its war effort until around 2027, though that sustaining will come with a trade-off. Older tanks are less capable on the battlefield and far more vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons, such as javelin munitions and drone strikes. So Russia will put more quantity onto the battlefield, but it will sacrifice quality in doing so, resulting in tanks being lost at an even faster rate than they were at the beginning of the war. And Russia faces another problem. Even its most advanced tanks aren't performing as well as Russia would expect on the battlefield. Take the T-90M, which the Kyiv Independent notes that Putin has often described as the best tank in the world. Ukraine has managed to destroy at least one of these tanks using a pair of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, which have been in military service since the 1980s. So Russia finds itself in a position where its best tank is not only facing modern weapons the West has supplied to Ukraine, but it's being taken out by older fighting vehicles. As we've moved deeper into 2024, the situation has only gotten worse for Russia. Toward the end of June 2024, Newsweek published a report on the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung's use of satellite imagery and artificial intelligence to work out how many tanks Russia has left. The paper analyzed 87 military sites, 16 of which were bases known to store tanks and armored vehicles, to get a count on the number of tanks Russia has lost since the beginning of the war. The 111th Central Tank Reserve base of the army, located in southeastern Russia, was one of the bases. Before the war, that base held 857 tanks. Now it's empty, with Süddeutsche Zeitung's artificial intelligence suggesting that Russia has lost at least half of the tanks deployed from that base. IISS research analyst Michael Gerstad sums up Russia's situation by suggesting the nation likely has around 3,200 tanks still in stock, though the vast majority of them are in bad condition and require significant repairs. If that's the case, Global Firepower's estimates are well off the true state of Russia's tank situation. Therein lies the tank problem for Russia. Does it invest an increasingly limited set of resources into restoring 3,000 old and battered tanks, or use them to build far fewer but new tanks? Either way, its battlefield losses are outstripping its means of production. Russia's armored vehicle situation isn't looking any better. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Information, or Minfin's figures, Russia has lost 16,095 armored fighting vehicles, or AFVs, as of July 3, 2024. These vehicles aren't used in the same way as tanks, which excel at breaking through battle lines, but are instead typically used to transport troops and carry out small attacks. Minfin's numbers seem to align with other estimates of Russian AFV losses, with Newsweek reporting in May 2024 that Russia had lost 14,246. It's not a huge stretch to imagine another 1,000 or so have been destroyed in the months since. Much like with Russia's tanks, Newsweek reports on the use of satellite imagery to determine how many AFVs Russia has left. Reporting on a post by an X, formerly Twitter account run by a user named Jompy, Newsweek shared that satellite images reveal Russia has just 10,389 AFVs left in storage. That's down 32% on the country's pre-war stocks, suggesting 4,763 older AFVs have been removed from storage as of May 2024. Digging into specifics, Newsweek notes that Russia has lost over 1,500 MTLBs, which are Soviet-era amphibious AFVs, meaning it only has 922 left from a previous stock of 2,527. BMDs are another major loser. The number of airborne and amphibious tracked infantry AFVs is down to 244 in stock from the pre-war numbers of 637. You may have spotted a trend here. Just as it has with its artillery and tanks, Russia has found itself relying on mothballed Soviet-era armored vehicles to continue fighting in Ukraine. These AFVs are being lost in huge numbers, in part because they're not technologically advanced enough to combat the drones that Ukraine has been using to destroy them. Chapter 97, translating a report published by the RBC Ukraine, highlights the severity of this problem. It also notes that Russia is resorting to using AFVs built in the 1970s, with some that have found their way into Ukraine being from the 60s and 50s, and that it's quickly running out of these older vehicles. It quotes Arta Ray, an Estonian military blogger, who claims that Russia will have run out of these mothballed AFVs by mid-2025, putting it in a situation where it'll need to produce more to keep its troops supplied. It's trying to do so. In February 2024, Forbes reported that Russia is building around 4,500 armored vehicles per year to replenish its faltering supplies on the front lines. An impressive number for sure, though one that doesn't keep pace with the country's losses. Ukraine has already destroyed over 15,000 AFVs in the war, creating a tally of around 6,000 per year, meaning that Russia's heightened pace of production isn't enough. Moscow will run out of AFVs as long as Ukraine keeps destroying them at the same rate it is now. If you need any more evidence that Russia has an AFV problem, you only need to look at recent purchase by Moscow. 2,100 Desert Cross 1003 all-terrain vehicles from China. While that name may sound impressive, the reality is that these all-terrain vehicles are essentially heavy-duty golf carts that offer practically no protection to the unfortunate soldiers forced to drive them. They weigh around 1.5 tons, about the same as the average car, and have 85 horsepower engines. And Russia is already using them in support roles on the front lines. These golf carts have already been the subject of ridicule and, more damaging for Russia's forces, have already been demonstrated as being extremely vulnerable to drone attacks. The Forbes report points to one such strike carried out by a drone which killed a squad of 7 soldiers as they attempted to use one of the carts to assault a Ukrainian position in Berditshy in March 2024. Golf carts on a battlefield. The fact they're being used at all showcases how dire Russia's armored fighting vehicle situation is. Still, at least it has plenty of missiles it can use to strike Ukrainian positions. Or does it? Reports often vary on Russia's missile stockpile, though there have been rumblings that it was running low almost from the war's beginning. In October 2022, Politico published an article in which it quoted several Western officials saying that Russia was experiencing a shortage of long-range precision missiles just 6 months into the war. One of those officials, speaking about Russia's early strategy of destroying as many Ukrainian power stations as possible, said the country was increasingly having to rely on Shahed drones purchased from Iran to carry out its strikes. Why? Its stockpile of cruise missiles was running low. Our assessment is that the ability for the Russians to continue with these saturating barrages of precision weapons is getting to the point now where this will be unsustainable, the official said in October. A January 2023 report in Defense and Security Monitor offered a more mixed viewpoint. It noted that Ukraine believed that Russia only had around 20% of its pre-war missile stockpiles left, amounting to just 550 missiles, or enough to conduct attacks on 2 or 3 cities. Russia, of course, denied this, claiming that it had enough missiles to continue the war, before adding they have thousands left and the ability to build more. Still, it's telling that Russia was already purchasing Iranian missiles at this point in the war, with Ukraine also pointing out that it was repurposing its S-300 and S-400 air defense missiles to attack ground targets. That repurposing wouldn't be needed if Russia had enough missiles. Plus, it's worth remembering that Putin himself has told people that Russia is running low on precision-guided munitions, suggesting that Ukraine may have been correct in its assessment. Running low isn't Russia's only problem. Just a month into the war, Reuters published a report that claimed some of Russia's missiles may have a failure rate as high as 60%. Quoting a trio of US officials, the outlet said this rate of failure is one of the reasons why Russia failed to compromise Ukraine's air force during the first month of the war, despite having launched 1,100 missiles. Air-launched cruise missiles had failure rates between 20 and 60%, claimed one of the officials, with others having failure rates as high as 50%. For context, a failure rate above 20% is considered high by these officials, meaning that Russia doesn't just have a stockpile problem. It's also dealing with many missiles that simply don't work. Russia also has an eye toward the future when it comes to its missiles. It believes it has reached a stage of open confrontation with NATO that, though it hasn't escalated into war, means that Russia needs to build more missiles. Speaking to Russia's RIA state-owned news agency in May 2024, Russian ambassador-at-large, Grigory Mashkov, made the open confrontation claim, while saying Russia hopes that direct armed conflict will not follow. Still, Mashkov says that Russia needs to be prepared, noting that it has to take further steps to strengthen the country's defense capability, including building up the missile arsenal, in order to discourage any potential enemies from testing Russia's strength. First Putin, and now a prominent official. Both say that Russia doesn't have enough missiles, with the ambassador putting that into the context of a possible future war with NATO. That means its stockpiles have run low enough due to the Ukraine war that it needs to replenish and is likely going to increasingly rely on drones ahead of missile strikes to preserve what it has left. Missiles were supposed to be another of Russia's trump cards in the Ukraine war. Still, there was another key advantage it had back in February 2022, a much stronger air force. Fortunately for Putin, Russia has failed so terribly at developing aerial dominance in Ukraine that it's also started to run out of planes it's trying to use to win the war. Minfin provides basic figures for how many aircraft Russia has lost so far. As of 3rd of July 2024, it claims that Ukraine has destroyed 360 planes, along with 326 helicopters. The situation has become so bad for Russia that it's barely using its air force in the war, instead relying on ground troops to achieve its objectives. However, barely using doesn't mean it's not using planes at all. It's just that those planes are getting shot down at an incredible rate. Take what happened in February 2024 as an example. Forbes reports that this month saw Ukraine conduct what it dubs a Sukhoi massacre, in which it managed to shoot down 4 Sukhoi Su-34 fighter bombers and 2 Sukhoi Su-35 fighters in just 3 days. That's notable because these planes are among the best in Russia's air force. Russia is far from in a position where it's going to run out of either of these planes. It still has 125 Su-34s and around 110 Su-35s. The problem here is that the few times that Russia has deployed what's supposed to be its best planes in Ukraine, they've been shot down. While it may not be running out in pure numbers, it's running out of situations, or perhaps the tactical knowledge, to deploy these aircraft. If that's the case, Russia may as well not have any at all. March 2024 brought with it reports that Ukraine is also chipping away at Russia's stockpile of A-50 spy planes. Russia has lost 2 of those planes to Ukrainian attacks in the first 2 months of 2024, in addition to seeing a base it uses to repair the planes damaged by a Ukrainian drone strike. A Newsweek report notes that Russia now has just 6 A-50s left, a definite shortage given that it relies on these planes to conduct aerial surveillance and reconnaissance. Lieutenant General Kirilo Budanov, who heads Ukraine's GUR intelligence agency, says that taking out one more A-50 would mean Ukraine prevents Russia from maintaining 24/7 operations. Russia is already trying to replace its downed A-50s with reconnaissance drones. Note that we said drones and not planes. That's because, as the Wilson Center reported in April 2024, the West's sanctions against Russia are preventing it from building more of its own planes. Most of the effects are being felt in Russia's attempts to build more commercial airlines. It initially, illegally, kept more than 400 foreign planes when sanctions were first instituted, but they're carrying over to the country's air force. After all, if Russia isn't getting the parts it needs to build its commercial airliners due to sanctions, it's also likely not receiving what it needs to build more military aircraft. In this case, Russia isn't going to run out of planes. It still has hundreds left, especially in its Soviet-era stock. However, it's proven itself so ineffectual at launching aerial assaults that it's barely using its air force. And when it has, it's having to watch Ukraine shoot down some of its best planes while it struggles to replace them. Finally, we come to ships. Russia's navy is in no danger of running out of ships. As Global Firepower reports, it has 781 naval assets. The problem is that the vast majority of these ships aren't involved in the Ukraine war. In fact, the only ships that it has that can fight back against Ukraine are part of the Black Sea Fleet, which contains around 60 to 70 of Russia's vessels, or at least it did. Ukraine has managed to destroy or damage around a third of the Black Sea Fleet since the beginning of the war, severely compromising Russia's ability to use its navy to strike Ukraine. Combining precision missile attacks with drone strikes, Ukraine has been whittling away at the fleet, safe in the knowledge that Russia isn't able to replenish it. Why? The Montreux Convention. Signed in July 1936, the Montreux Convention is notable because it essentially grants Turkey control over the seaborne passage through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, collectively known as the Turkish Straits. Specifically, Article 19 of that convention says that Turkey can close access to the Black Sea via these straits to any military ship that doesn't call the sea its home base. That's precisely what it's done since the war began. No vessels from the Russian Navy, or from any other country's navy for that matter, can enter the Black Sea. Russia was able to keep the Black Sea Fleet in place because it was stationed in the sea, but it couldn't supplement that naval force with any new ships. So Russia isn't at risk of running out of ships on the global level, but in the context of the Ukraine war, it's already lost a third of its ships and it can't rebuild the Black Sea Fleet because it's banned from sailing military vessels through the Turkish Straits. It's running out of ships it can actually use to fight against Ukraine, with the rest of its navy essentially being ineffectual to the same degree as the country's air force. There's no point in having over 700 naval assets if you can't bring them to the fight. The final question is simple. Where does all of this leave Russia? It's facing a situation where it's increasingly less able to keep its troops supplied with modern weapons, forcing it to rely on Soviet-era stock and other countries to keep weapons flowing in. Russia has attempted to boost production, as we've seen with its artillery and AFV building, but it's unable to keep up with the pace of the losses it's experienced in Ukraine. None of this means that Russia is on the verge of losing the war right now. It still has stockpiles, and it's shown it's willing to sign pacts with countries like North Korea to get what it needs. But each passing day weakens Russia's military as it burns through more of its weapons. That only spells bad news for the country in the future. But what do you think? Will Russia eventually lose the Ukraine war because it runs out of weapons? Or does it have enough to continue to slowly gain ground in Ukraine? How big a role has Western support played in helping to drain Russia's supplies? Putin's burgeoning Russian empire is collapsing from the inside. To the man who has seemingly made it his life's work to turn Russia into what it used to be, this is a horror story. For more than a decade, he's been trying to claim land for his beloved Russia. The 2008 invasion of Georgia set alarm bells ringing. He followed that up with the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and in February 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine that continues to this day. He did it all, in part, to reclaim territory that he believes Russia should rightfully own. But all he's achieved is laying the foundation for the collapse of Russia as we know it, as he has left his country on the brink of civil war. Putin's citizens are turning against him. His position as the strongman of Russian politics is in serious jeopardy. And the worst thing about all of this for Putin, we've seen it all happen before. The collapse of an empire requires a catalyst. That catalyst came on August 6, 2024, when Ukraine did something nobody believed it would ever do: invade the Kursk Oblast. Interestingly, the first news about the Kursk invasion didn't come from Ukraine. It made no grand proclamations of its intention to take Russian territory. Rather, they came from Russia, with the country's defense ministry announcing that a group of 300 Ukrainian soldiers had crossed the border into Kursk at 8 a.m. on August 6th. Those soldiers apparently wore blue tape around their arms, making them distinguishable from their enemies, and were accompanied by a small number of tanks and armored vehicles. The initial attack focused on checkpoints across the border, where the few dozen Russian border guards, many of whom were young conscripts with little experience of actual war, were quick to surrender to the invading Ukrainians. At the time, Russia claimed to have repelled the attack. The truth would turn out to be the exact opposite. Within a day of the invasion starting, Ukrainian armored vehicles were seen racing toward the town of Sudza, which is just 6 miles behind the front lines. By the third day, Ukraine's soldiers had reached Kurovino, a small village 13 miles inside the border. More gains followed. Ukraine kept advancing, taking villages along the way. 10 days into the invasion, Ukraine had taken Sudza, establishing it as a command center from which to coordinate future attacks. This prompted Putin to promise that he would deliver a worthy response to the invasion. That response is yet to come. Instead, this initial week and a half of the Kursk invasion saw Russia being forced to evacuate around 200,000 civilians from the region, while Putin was left scrambling to pull some of the 500,000 troops he had stationed in Ukraine to mount a proper defense against them. Fast forward to the end of August, the time of writing the script for this video, and Ukraine now claims to control almost 500 square miles of Russian territory within the Kursk region. That's according to its main military commander, General Alexander Syrsky, who also adds that Ukraine has captured 594 Russian prisoners so far as part of the operation. For context, the amount of seized territory is roughly the same size as Los Angeles, according to the LA Times. Further reports, this time from the BBC, claim that Ukraine now controls about 100 Russian settlements within those 500 square miles, each of which can now be fortified against the likely Russian counterattack. The entire invasion has been an enormous humiliation for Putin. For the entire war, he set himself up as the strongman of Russia, a role that many a Russian leader before him has attempted to play: authoritative, decisive, strong enough to do what needs to be done. This was the image Putin hoped to cultivate, and a large part of his success in creating that image lay in his ability to portray Russia as impenetrable. The average Russian citizen wouldn't have to worry about the Ukraine war, he could argue. The entire conflict would take place in Ukraine. At no point would war come to Russia's collective doorstep. The Kursk invasion proved that to be false. And that leads us to a question: why did Ukraine invade Kursk in the first place? It certainly doesn't intend to annex the region and claim it as part of Ukraine, as Putin did with Crimea back in 2014. Though Ukraine is pouring more and more troops into the region, with Forbes saying it has plans to send 15,000 soldiers along with a pair of air assault brigades, those soldiers aren't tasked with turning Kursk over to Ukrainian hands. The taking of territory in Kursk does not signify the start of a larger invasion that will see Putin's empire crumble as a result of him losing country to invading Ukrainians. Zelensky's intentions are a little more complex than that. One interpretation is that the Kursk invasion is supposed to act as a diversionary tactic. Ukraine hopes that forcing Russia to divert troops to Kursk will relieve pressure on the beleaguered Donbas region in Ukraine, where Putin has focused most of his attacks in 2024 and where Russia is slowly gaining territory. In particular, Zelensky may have hoped to draw Russian soldiers away from Pokrovsk, which Forbes claims is one of Putin's main objectives in his eastern offensive in Ukraine. If that was the intention, the invasion may have failed in its diversionary goal. On August 28, Forbes reported that Russia had taken the Ukrainian village of Novorodivka, which lies just 5 miles outside of Pokrovsk. Putin is likely setting up for a renewed offensive, and Ukraine's commitment of troops to Kursk could mean that it's less able to mount a sturdy defense in response. Other motives put forward by Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institution fellow Paul Danieri seem to make more sense. Speaking to the University of California, Riverside, he points out that it's not clear exactly how the Kursk invasion will affect the key battles being fought in the Ukraine war. However, it serves other purposes. The invasion's initial success, he says, is clearly a big morale booster for Ukrainians and a political problem for Putin and his military leaders. The latter issue is extremely important in terms of why Kursk could prove to be the catalyst for the collapse of modern Russia. As Danieri points out, Putin took the rare step of appearing on Russian television to dress down his military leaders in front of the entire nation. His intention was clear: continue to project the strongman image that served him so well as Russian leader. The problem lies in what the Kursk invasion has managed to achieve: the shattering of Russia's aura of invincibility. Putin's dressing down of his military leaders took place while Ukraine was taking more territory and thousands of Russians were being evacuated. Putin could no longer hold himself up as the man to protect Russia. Dressing down his military leaders in public may also prove to be a mistake. After all, it raises questions as to why those leaders were appointed in the first place, if they were incompetent enough to allow a Ukrainian invasion. The Russian people may not be able to question Putin publicly, but privately, many are likely starting to doubt the decision-making capabilities of their leader. Therein we find what may be the true motive for the Kursk invasion. Zelensky likely knows that Ukraine can't hold Kursk forever. Russia will launch a counter-offensive at some point. Deputy CIA Director David Cohen says this is practically an inevitability, saying on August 28th, "We can be certain that Putin will mount a counter-offensive to try to reclaim that territory." He notes that it will be a difficult fight for Russia, especially as Putin's slow response has afforded Ukraine time to build defensive lines, but the counterattack is coming. Unfortunately for Putin, the response may be too little too late. Ukraine has already achieved one of its primary goals of rattling Russia's faith in its militaristic leader. The strongman image is shattered, not only for the Russian military as a whole, but also for the man who leads it. And if everything goes according to plan for Ukraine, the Kursk invasion will serve as both the turning point for the Ukraine war and the beginning of the end for Putin. Of course, that brings us to an obvious question: how? How could the Kursk invasion trigger a civil war in Russia, or at the very least, lead to the burgeoning empire Putin is trying to build collapsing? The answer starts with something to which we've already alluded. The Kursk invasion showcases Putin's military miscalculations. This starts with his failure to reinforce Russia's northern borders with Ukraine, as Putin has poured all of his efforts into the eastern offensive during 2024. That led to the situation we saw on August 6th, when Ukraine's forces were able to easily overcome Russia's border checkpoints. Putin has assigned recent Russian conscript to those checkpoints, none of whom had the experience or ability to fight back against the incoming Ukrainian forces. Worse yet, as retired Russian General Andrei Gurylev, who is a member of the lower house of Russia's parliament, points out, those border soldiers had no intelligence. Regrettably, the group of forces protecting the border didn't have its own intelligence assets, he claimed on the Telegram messaging app. No one likes to see the truth in reports. Everybody just wants to hear that all is good. The truth in reports. Those 4 words are a reflection of the fact that many in Russia, including some in its own political circles, recognize that the information they get from state-owned media outlets is tailored to keep Putin in power. Russia's leader isn't telling his people the truth about what's happening in Kursk, but his attempts to pull the wool over their eyes are failing. After all, they can see the evidence with their own eyes. Russia has lost territory, and the people of Kursk are being evacuated. All of this can be traced back to Putin's military mistakes, both in terms of failing to secure the Kursk border and not providing his troops with the intelligence they needed. Putin made another mistake. He underestimated General Alexander Syrsky. Now Ukraine's top military officer, Syrsky commanded Ukraine's forces in Kharkiv in 2022, leading the country to a victory over the invading Russian forces that played a key role in Russia's failure to secure Kyiv in the early weeks of the war. Syrsky is a man who had the call sign Snow Leopard, and he's also the man who took over from General Valery Zaluzhny after Zelensky ousted his former military leader in early 2024. Putin's mistake lay in assuming that Syrsky would take the same approach as his predecessor when it comes to launching attacks against Russian forces. In 2023, Zaluzhny was the man responsible for organizing a Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia. That counteroffensive failed, not least because it was so highly publicized that Russia had plenty of time to set up defenses that enabled them to hold the territory Ukraine hoped to retake. Putin got to look like a military genius in front of his people, the man who organized Russia's military to hold off the biggest offensive Ukraine was capable of mustering. But the reality was that Putin's success only came because of Zaluzhny's failings, with Syrsky being a far different beast. Ukraine's new military leader is described as an obsessive planner with iron discipline by Sky News, with Al Jazeera noting that some in Ukraine call him the Butcher. He also favors quiet and precise strikes against his enemies over full-blown and well-publicized offensives. We saw this in his approach to taking on a Putin-backed insurgency in eastern Ukraine back in 2014, during which the Russian security official Dmitry Medvedev described him using tactics that were similar to how this cat hunts, in reference to his snow leopard call sign. So the warning signs were there. Any attack arranged by Syrsky would be extremely well organized and would not involve an all-out offensive at which body after body is thrown. The strikes will be small, precise, scattered. In other words, exactly what we've seen in Kursk, as Ukraine's forces conduct tactical strikes against their Russian opposition by using smaller groups. Putin should have known all of this about Syrsky. He'd seen plenty of Syrsky's approach on the battlefield, yet he underestimated the Ukrainian military leader and by extension, underestimated Ukraine's ability to take Russian territory. Here we start to see some parallels between Putin and his Soviet-era predecessors. After all, Russia has a history of underestimating its opponents. In the 1980s, Russia entered Afghanistan, believing that it would be able to quickly destroy the rebels in that country and subjugate it under Soviet rule. The Soviet Union failed. It wound up stuck in a quagmire of a war that lasted for almost a decade and led to the deaths of 15,000 Soviet soldiers. Russia was forced to withdraw. Bruce Riedel, who worked on the CIA's plan to aid the Afghan rebels at the time, points out that Putin seems to have underestimated the Ukrainians today, in the same way that the Soviet Union underestimated Afghanistan. Milton Bearden, another CIA operative during the Afghanistan war, puts it more pointedly. In setting out to reverse history, Putin may instead be repeating it. Patterns are starting to repeat. The Ukraine war, which was meant to be over in a matter of weeks, has descended into a quagmire similar to that seen in Afghanistan in the 80s. Only this time it's a quagmire that's costing far more Russian lives, 612,390, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance and various other outlets. The Washington Post says that Russia's war in Afghanistan led to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin's underestimation of his Ukrainian enemy may be taking him and today's Russia down the very same path. Underestimating his enemy isn't the only way that Putin has undermined his own position. The Kursk invasion is just one of several examples during his reign in which he's failed to protect the Russian people. The Conversation published a piece covering this toward the end of August 2024, noting that Kursk is just the latest puncture hole in Putin's image of protector in a long line. It points out that the Ukraine war has seen multiple Russian towns and cities, including Moscow, be subjected to drone attacks by Ukraine. It also draws parallels between the Kursk invasion and another famous Kursk incident, the sinking of the nuclear submarine that bore the oblast's name. On August 12, 2000, around 3 months after Putin first became Russia's president, the Kursk submarine experienced an explosion in one of its torpedo hatches. Most of the submarine's 118-member crew died, though 23 survivors managed to barricade themselves in a compartment of the submarine where they awaited rescue. Here was an opportunity for Putin to solidify his reputation as a protector of the Russian people. Instead, he delayed. Putin refused foreign help for fear that doing so would make him look weak. When Norwegian divers were eventually allowed down into the submarine on August 21st, the 23 survivors of the blast were dead. Putin refused to talk about the incident, going so far as to not even cancel a vacation he was taking in Sochi when the crisis occurred. A pattern of behavior had been set. On September 1, 2004, a group of 30 armed militants stormed a school in the Russian city of Beslan, taking 1,000 hostages that included children, family members, and teachers. Putin acted a little quicker this time. He ordered special forces to enter the building on September 3rd. A bloodbath ensued. The chaotic battle led to hundreds of the hostages being killed, including 186 children. Both survivors and relatives of those killed sued the Russian government via the European Court of Human Rights, alleging that Putin had mishandled the entire situation. They won. The court ruled that Russia's government had failed to protect the hostages. What does all of this mean? More patterns are emerging. Not only does Putin regularly underestimate the situations he faces, but he often makes the wrong decisions. These decisions have an impact on the Russian people, whether those be the 23 who die in the submarine because he delays, or hundreds dying in a school because he bungles. His mismanagement of the Kursk invasion is yet another example of Putin's failure to protect his people, and it may be the final straw. Again, we see parallels with the Soviet Union, in the sense that as powerful as a leader may be, it's the people who ultimately control the fate of their countries. The fall of the Soviet Union was precipitated by mass protests, such as the April 1991 protest in Minsk's Lenin Square and the August 1989 protest featuring 2 million people in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The people were making their unhappiness with the current regime known. Putin's failure to protect his people, a pattern that he has displayed throughout his leadership, could lead to similar situations in today's Russia. After all, he's already having to deal with fury amongst those people. On August 17, 2024, The Guardian published a piece in which it spoke to a Russian woman named Lyubov Antipova. The daughter of elderly parents who lived in Zalshenka, a village in the Kursk region. She claims that she implored her parents to leave their village when she first started hearing rumors about an invasion. Antipova's parents didn't listen. Why would they? Putin was in charge and they hadn't seen any sort of invasion since World War II. Then the photographs started filtering through. One showed Ukrainian troops standing outside a supermarket near the office of a gas company. Antipova knew the location well. It was only around 150 feet from her parents' home. "We were sure the Russian army would protect us," Antipova says. "I'm amazed how quickly the Ukrainian forces advanced." Others in Kursk were similarly caught off guard by the invasion. Alexander Zorin, who is the curator of the city's archaeology museum, says that the reports being given to him were inaccurate. Officials' reports were not scary at all. 100 saboteurs went in, he says. But then it went up to 300, 800. It was impossible to get a clear picture. Zorin would wind up being one of the 200,000 people who have since been evacuated from Kursk. Other Russian citizens have expressed anger about Putin's response to the Kursk invasion. Speaking to CBC, a Ukrainian soldier who wishes to be identified by the tagline "Wolverine" said that many of the citizens he encountered have expressed anger at the authorities. They speak about betrayal from the Russian government. They did not declare evacuation and immediately turned off water and light, so they created unbearable living conditions, he claimed. He also provided CBC with a short, albeit edited video that showed a Russian man complaining about feeling abandoned by Russian authorities. Of course, none of these people mentioned Putin by name. To do so would be to invite repercussions, but the message is clear. Putin is the head of Russia and the man who put these authorities in place. Once again, he had failed to protect his people. What's more, that lack of protection was accompanied by a constant campaign of disinformation. Again, much as was seen throughout the entirety of the Soviet Union's existence, that led many in Kursk to fail to protect themselves because they didn't understand the sheer scale of what was coming. Putin is on the verge of losing the support of his people. And that's not his only problem when it comes to his own people. A strongman politician like Putin relies on support from his country's elite. It's a you scratch our back and we'll scratch yours situation, in which the elite use their influence to prop up the leader as long as they feel they're getting something in return. Those elites may also be starting to turn against Putin. After all, many have been affected by the Western sanctions that have been put in place since the beginning of the war. Oligarchs and officials close to Putin have also felt the sting of the West freezing their assets. In addition to the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets that the West has frozen and are now being used to fund Ukraine, another $30 billion in assets owned by officials and oligarchs are also immobilized. Russia's elites, though they'll never see the war up close, are feeling its pinch in their pockets. Many have been oddly silent about the war, with few coming out to express full support for Putin. A handful even believe that Russia could lose. In June 2023, Pravda published a report citing a Bloomberg article from the same month, stating that some of Russia's elite are experiencing a deepening gloom. Even the most optimistic among them believe that the best outcome possible now is a frozen conflict in which both countries declare ceasefires without actively ending the war. The piece also quotes Kirill Rogov, a former advisor to Putin who left Russia after the invasion began. They're afraid to become scapegoats for a meaningless war, he says. It's really surprising how widespread among the Russian elite became the idea of a chance Putin won't win this war. Bear in mind these comments came in June 2023, over a year later, and those elites are watching as Putin has failed to repel an invasion into Russian territory. Where does all of this leave Putin when it comes to his people? It would be inaccurate to claim that the general citizens are calling for the Russian leader's head. They aren't, and any who would like to would be restricted from doing so by Putin's policies anyway. But there's a clear feeling of discontent. The people of Kursk are angry, and not only with the misinformation Putin has spread, but his lack of proper response to the invasion that once again showcases his pattern of failing to take decisive action in service of his people. Putin also appears to be losing the support of some of Russia's elite, with discontent growing and an ever-increasing feeling that Russia isn't going to win the Ukraine war looming over that segment of the population. In short, Putin is losing the support of his people. And as Russia's own history has shown time and again, even an authoritarian strongman leader is at risk of seeing their empire crumble once the people turn against them. The Kursk invasion may prove to be the catalyst for rebellion against Putin, but could such a rebellion lead to civil war? While that may seem like an impossibility on the surface, it's worth remembering that Russia came very close to experiencing a civil war in June 2023. That's when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former leader of the Wagner private military group, essentially declared an insurrection against Putin and Russia's military leaders. Wagner had already played a key role in the Ukraine war, with the brutal group having been involved almost from the beginning. German intelligence claims that Wagner soldiers were involved in the massacre of Ukrainian civilians in the Ukrainian town of Bucha in March 2022, with Ukraine also claiming that a trio of Wagner mercenaries were responsible for capturing, torturing, and killing Ukrainian civilians near Kyiv a month later. By June 2023, Wagner had grown dissatisfied with how Putin was leading the war, resulting in the force, under Prigozhin's leadership, advancing through the city of Rostov-on-Don to surround Russia's southern military headquarters. The coup ended quickly, with Prigozhin reversing his decision very soon after. Still, it showcases just how tenuous Putin's hold on power may be. If a group like Wagner is able to gain support from Russia's rank-and-file military, according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, such insurrections would grow larger and far more significant. If those rebels gain the support of the Russian people, whose collective confidence in Putin as a protector and strongman has already been shaken, the potential for a civil war that leads to Putin being ousted will only grow. Add to all of this that Putin is making many of the same mistakes made by the Soviet leaders who came before him. We see this in the repeated nuclear threats toward both Ukraine and nations that have supported it during the war. Such threats of nuclear war were constant during the Cold War, though no Soviet leader ever followed up on them. Putin is doing the same thing, threatening nukes without deploying them. Not only do these empty threats reinforce Ukraine's confidence when crossing red lines in the war, but they once again showcase Putin as a man who doesn't back up his words to the Russian people. But perhaps most damaging to Putin is the potential for his people to start seeing him as a mirror image of Joseph Stalin. According to the Hoover Institute, Putin mirrors Stalin in many ways. While he may not have swept up millions in purges, Putin has never shied away from getting rid of his enemies. We need only look at Yevgeny Prigozhin for evidence of that. The former Wagner leader died in August 2023 when his business jet crashed over the Tver Oblast. The likely cause of that explosion was a bomb placed on the plane by a Putin-aligned saboteur. Putin also mirrors Stalin in other ways. Both are militaristic leaders, even if Putin doesn't wear his uniform as Stalin did, and both relied on projecting powerful images to remain in control. Both also routinely replace the people around them, with a specific focus on military generals who failed to achieve the outcomes they'd hoped to. Hoover also points out that the two share motifs in their propaganda, with each calling for sacrifices in service of the motherland, with those sacrifices coming in the form of the blood of their people. You could even argue that Putin displays a callous disregard for the Russian people, as seen in the Kursk submarine incident and the bungled approach to the Beslan hostage crisis. Each are echoes of Stalin's willingness to kill his own to maintain his power base. Parallels among parallels, not just in personality but in approach. Ultimately, it's those parallels that may spell the end for Putin and cause his Russian empire to crumble. He's failed to learn from the mistakes of his country's past. It's Putin's underestimation of his enemies and overestimation of himself that allowed the Kursk invasion to happen. As a result of that invasion, discontent is growing among his people, with that discontent only adding to that felt by many of the Russian elite. Putin has already had to fight off one insurrection during the war, and there's a good chance more will come as his people grow increasingly disaffected. Vladimir Putin is on shaky ground. Ground that's so shaky that it may be his own people who defeat him before Ukraine does, which might come as early as 2025 if some strategists are correct, but more on that in some of our other videos. But what do you think? Does Putin stand on the precipice of losing his power, or will he find some way to recover his strongman image? For months, a large-scale Russian summer offensive was all anyone was talking about. Ever since the reputable US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW for short, warned about the Kremlin's plans, the media has been in a frenzy, labeling the ensuing period as key in the Russo-Ukrainian war and saying that it could even end the war in Ukraine. Western analysts speculated, the Ukrainian government prepared, and the world held its breath. The anticipation was palpable, the tension unbearable, and then nothing. Sure, the much-anticipated summer offensive did come, with a combined force of 40,000 Russian troops launching an assault across Ukraine's northern border on May 9th, Russia's Victory Day, symbolizing the country's triumph over Nazi Germany in World War II. Of course, the date was chosen deliberately to evoke a sense of historical destiny and inevitable success over the neo-Nazi regime, which is what Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed Ukraine has become. Yet despite the dramatic timing and intense build-up, the offensive spluttered and evoked the name of William Shakespeare's famous comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. Even NATO's top officials like Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, weren't sure whether the offensive had actually begun or not, which speaks volumes about its underwhelming execution and lack of impact. Though Russia did make some advances and continues to do so, this summer offensive can, for the most part, be labeled as a colossal failure. Why? And how is it possible for the offensive previously hailed as the war-ending blow to come to a halt after barely a few miles in? That's precisely what you'll find out in this video. You'll also learn how and why the offensive started in the first place, what it aimed to achieve, and what's in store for the future of this conflict. Let's begin. The number one question that probably comes to mind when hearing about a Russian summer offensive is, how was Russia even able to launch it? After all, the Russian armed forces had faced significant setbacks in the preceding months and, let's face it, the entire invasion of Ukraine. According to a May 8th report by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, by the invasion date, Russia had lost as many as 477,430 troops in Ukraine. Similar losses in equipment were reported as well, with Russia bidding farewell to 7,418 tanks, 14,246 armored fighting vehicles, 16,549 vehicles and fuel tanks, 12,317 artillery systems, 1,057 multiple launch rocket systems, 792 air defense systems, 349 aircraft, 325 helicopters, 9,728 drones, 26 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. So how was Russia able to pull off an offensive in the summer of 2024? The answer is simple. Russia did what Russia does best: exploit vulnerabilities. You see, Russia has suffered immense losses since February 24, 2022, when the invasion first started. But so did Ukraine. The defending force was grappling with a shortage of men and ammunition, allowing Russia to capitalize on these weaknesses. However, there was one thing that primarily gave Russia the initiative to launch its summer offensive: the delay in Western aid. The US, Ukraine's largest donor with over $43 billion in military aid provided in just 2 years, faced a challenging period starting in the fall of 2023 when new aid packages were held up. This delay was primarily due to the intense debates in Congress, where some members questioned the continuation of military support in the face of competing domestic priorities. During these discussions, concerns over immigration and border security took center stage, leading to a temporary pause in aid decisions. Unfortunately, while these debates were ongoing, the Ukrainian battlefield faced significant challenges. The delay in military supplies allowed Russia to capitalize on its temporary advantage in firepower, escalating attacks along the 600-mile front. These operations started in October 2023 and had a single goal: to demoralize Ukraine in the West. As months passed and no aid arrived, the Russian armed forces became wrongly convinced that their plan was working. That's where the idea for the summer offensive was likely conceived. Thanks to making some tactical gains in midwinter, the Kremlin seemingly became convinced that it could eventually collapse the Ukrainian defense line, as an ISW report puts it, and so the preparations began. Obviously, the ultimate goal was to cause a general collapse of the Ukrainian front line and achieve a grand Russian breakthrough after months of suffering humiliating losses. But what were the specific military objectives of the summer offensive? The truth is, no one outside the Kremlin knows. The summer offensive has been executed so poorly that all we're left with is guesswork and speculation about its true military objectives. According to Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Russia's goal was only to stretch out Ukraine's forces and deal a decisive blow to its combat strength. Others saw the summer offensive as a blitzkrieg attempt whose ultimate goal was Kyiv, the city that Putin has long coveted as the ultimate prize. He holds an almost mystical reverence for Kyiv, considering it the very heart of Russian civilization. However, the prevailing view is that the Russian summer offensive is nothing but a ruse. You see, the offensive was launched in the Kharkiv Oblast, opening a new northern front in Ukraine. However, many analysts believe that seizing Kharkiv isn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is for the Ukrainian troops to believe Russia is after Kharkiv, compelling them to redeploy their eastern forces to the north. With Ukraine's position in the east weakened, Russia will be able to achieve its true goal, capturing, or as the Kremlin puts it, liberating the entire Donetsk Oblast. Seizing Donetsk has long been one of Putin's main goals, as it would solidify Russia's control over a crucial part of eastern Ukraine and bolster the Kremlin's strategic position in the region. After Donetsk, there's Luhansk, and before you know it, the Kremlin could potentially establish a contiguous corridor of control through the Donbas region. Of course, there are also those who believe that the Russian commanders purposefully made the goals of the summer offensive unclear, allowing them to change them depending on the Ukrainian response. While this approach can be viewed as flexible, it likely reflects a lack of clear strategy and tendency toward opportunistic, reactive planning rather than decisive, well-thought-out objectives, aka the Russian special. But to be honest, by now, it doesn't even matter what the initial goals were or whether they even existed. All that matters is that Russia failed to achieve them. Before discussing why, let's do a brief overview of the course of the summer offensive and the tactics used to understand how the situation unfolded and went wrong. As mentioned, the offensive officially started on May 9th. However, May 10th was when the Russian forces started shelling positions in the direction of the city of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv Oblast using guided bombs. The very same day, the Russian troops attempted to break through the front line, with about 5 Russian infantry battalions crossing the state border and capturing the villages of Borisivka, Krasna, Pilna, and Strilecha. From there, Russia made some of its biggest territorial gains in 18 months. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian forces seized control of roughly 10 villages by May 17th, advancing some 6 miles into the Kharkiv Oblast. However, it's important to note that these villages were mostly lightly defended small settlements. The offensive operations continued every day throughout May, but no changes to the front lines were recorded. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia's much-anticipated summer offensive stalled by early June, before the summer even officially began. By June 6th, the Russian forces ceased their offensive towards Lipsy, a village in Kharkiv Oblast the Russians were previously heavily pursuing. This probably had to do with the stiff Ukrainian defenses waiting for them in the area, reinforced by a few mechanized brigades, each about 2,000 strong, that arrived from the south. The Ukrainian forces also intensified counterattacks, managing to push their Russian counterparts back from several areas. By the end of June, there were no changes to the front line, and Ukraine managed to recapture many of the positions the Russian troops claimed in the initial push. July started just as forcefully, with the 3rd Assault Brigade claiming that it eliminated an entire battalion of Russian soldiers, killing 154 and wounding 301. The brigade also took credit for the destruction of a D-20 howitzer, 3 Russian-made Zala drones, and a tank. The fighting continued throughout July, and yet there were no recorded changes to the front line. On July 14th, the ISW reported a claim that the Russian Northern Grouping of Forces, the unit responsible for the summer offensive, didn't have enough troops for a fully fledged penetration of Ukrainian defenses to a depth of 25 miles. As you can see, the Russian tactic of pursuing multiple efforts simultaneously up and down the front didn't exactly pan out. Of course, Putin framed the embarrassing performance of his troops in Kharkiv Oblast as intentional, saying that Moscow isn't seeking any quick gains and that slow advances are all part of their strategy. As for the specific tactics used on the battlefield, they can best be described in one word: bizarre. Based on the accounts of the Ukrainian soldiers, the Russian troops would put soldiers on motorcycles and send them off toward the front line. The goal was to ride as fast as possible and avoid being hit. The ones who survived this suicide mission would ditch the bikes and move into trenches, fighting as infantry. This insane tactic had to be deployed for one reason: Russia has had issues with the lack of armor for its ground forces. Another solution for this issue came in the form of the so-called turtle tanks. Turtle tanks are makeshift armored vehicles, often cobbled together from available resources to compensate for the shortage of the more advanced and heavily protected tanks. These vehicles resemble a moving barn, and their goal is to absorb fire in an effort to clear a path for other units. With these risky tactics in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia lost quite a few military personnel and much equipment in the summer offensive. But before discussing the reasons why this offensive failed so spectacularly and resulted in excessive loss of people and weapons, let's focus on the one that set the stage for the failure in Kharkiv Oblast: poor preparation. As mentioned, the idea for the Russian summer offensive was born out of the opportunity to exploit the destabilization of the Ukrainian forces due to a lack of military aid. As months dragged on, only two scenarios emerged for Ukraine. One, it would not be receiving US military aid again, as the political climate shifted and the support for Ukraine within the country waned. Or two, the delivery of aid would eventually resume, but it would take some time before the first weapons arrived in Ukraine. Although the Kremlin was convinced that scenario number one was far more likely, the Russians still didn't want to take any chances. This meant that they only had a limited window of opportunity to strike before the arrival of resumed US security assistance. So the Russian armed forces rushed to carry out their theater-wide offensive. However, in doing so, they seemingly forgot a crucial aspect of military strategy: thorough preparation. Benjamin Franklin once said, "If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail." And that's precisely what Russia did. The hasty approach led to poorly coordinated efforts, a lack of clear objectives, and a failure to truly capitalize on the initial advantage they sought to exploit. According to Kaufman, the offensive was launched way too early. His exact words were, "It's now clear that the Russians launched the Kharkiv offensive about a month before it was planned." The idea was to take the Ukrainian forces by surprise, which was somewhat accomplished based on the initial Russian success. However, the offensive seemingly took the Russians by surprise too, as some of the units assigned to the operation, such as the 4th Army Corps, hadn't even finished training. So instead of Ukrainians peeling troops out of the Donbass to send them up north, which was one of the goals of the offensive, the Russians ended up reassigning troops from the east. The lack of proper preparation can also be seen in the fact that the summer offensive was supposed to be carried out with 100,000 soldiers. However, even well past the start of the offensive, the ISW estimated there were 70,000 soldiers at most, even placing the lower end of the estimate at 30,000. It's clear that the Kremlin didn't allow sufficient time to mobilize, train, and deploy the necessary forces, further exacerbating the Russian operational deficiencies. So instead of taking Kharkiv Oblast by storm, all that Putin's poorly prepared offensive managed to achieve was to produce catastrophically high casualty rates. How high are we talking? The highest in the entire conflict. According to the British Ministry of Defense, Russia was losing as many as 1,262 soldiers per day in May and 1,162 in June. Similar figures were seen in July and August, with Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi explaining that the Russians were willing to suffer heavy losses for minor gains. But if we're being honest, this is nothing new in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Even if the summer offensive was carefully planned and executed, chances are there would still be high casualty rates due to Putin's fondness for the so-called meat grinder military tactic. This tactic essentially involves overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers, sending wave after wave of troops into battle regardless of the heavy losses. In Kharkiv, Putin showed that even a lack of substantial troop numbers didn't prevent him from sacrificing Russian lives with similar tactics. The motorcycle riders we discussed earlier are a prime example of this brutal strategy, which highlights the costly nature of Russia's approach to warfare. As operator Starsky, a Ukrainian veteran and blogger, puts it, Russians use their soldiers as cannon fodder. This is further proven by sending soldiers to battle in embarrassingly small units once the meat grinder runs out of large quantities of meat. According to numerous Western analysts, that's precisely what prevented Russia from making any substantial gains, let alone a breakthrough in Ukraine's defensive lines in Kharkiv. Approximately 10 to 15 unmounted infantry troops would make probing attacks to test defenses. In worst-case scenarios, as few as 6 men would try to sneak across no man's land to gain a trench foothold. But regardless of the exact approach the Russian forces take, the result remains the same: a substantial loss of life. From there, their general approach is just to mobilize more troops once the initial waves have been depleted. That's why Russia has been mobilizing about 30,000 people per month since 2024 began. As a result of this horrifying approach, Russia lost over 70,000 troops in only 2 months, with the Kharkiv offensive significantly contributing to these figures. This astronomical figure, provided by British intelligence, includes both wounded and killed soldiers. With it, the total number of Russian troop losses in Ukraine from February 24, 2022 to July 31, 2024 amounts to an astronomical 578,120. Worst of all, as long as the summer offensive continues, Russia's casualty rates are likely to average above 1,000 per day. Now, there's a reason why the numbers of killed and injured soldiers are reported together. In general, the soldiers who have been gravely injured on the battlefield don't return to the fight, meaning they contribute to the general loss of combat effectiveness. However, when it comes to Russia, any rules of military engagement fly straight out of the window, not unlike many of Putin's adversaries. You see, the members of the Ukrainian army have reported numerous cases of injured Russian soldiers being sent back to the front lines despite suffering debilitating injuries. Of course, by going back, they've all but signed their death warrant, raising the number of Russian fatalities and further weakening their offensive. Unfortunately, these cases aren't even the most horrific stories coming from the Russian ranks. According to operator Starsky, there are many reported cases, and even more disturbingly, videos, of Russian forces committing suicide because they're left stranded by their own, abandoned in dire conditions with no medical support or hope of rescue. With how little the Kremlin cares about its soldiers, can anyone truly blame them for the lack of morale and dedication needed to pull off something as ambitious as the summer offensive? What further complicates their situation is the heavy equipment losses in Kharkiv. After all, a soldier without proper gear is a sitting duck doomed to face slaughter. For Russia, the trouble lies in the fact that it can't replace the destroyed equipment. Even though Putin has ramped up military production to unprecedented levels, the constraints on the Russian defense industrial base are more than evident. For now, Ukrainian forces seem to be most proud of destroying Russian tanks, which forces the country's troops to resort to their ridiculous turtle tanks and fighter jets like the Sukhoi Su-25, which have been launching the devastating guided aerial bombs used in the region. When it comes to destroying Russian equipment in the border areas, the Ukrainian forces have seemed to heavily focus on the country's air defense systems. While these actions have contributed to significant Russian losses during the offensive, they primarily reflect a strategic focus on crippling key components of Russia's military capability before a crucial event: the arrival of the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jets. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading for these jets practically since the invasion started. Even after Western allies finally pledged a number of the F-16s to Ukraine, the delivery has been plagued by numerous delays, leaving the Ukrainian forces waiting and hoping for a decisive boost to their air capabilities. Even so, they work on creating the right conditions for when these aircraft finally came. And good news for Ukraine, on July 31st, the first batch officially arrived. For now, we don't know how many jets Ukraine received and where they all came from. All we know is that they are part of at least 79 units pledged by the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium and Norway, and that they have the potential to completely crush the Russian offensive. The same goes for the rest of the Western-supplied military aid. Following the 6-month-long legislative blockade of the $61 billion military aid package for Ukraine, the US rushed to deliver help to the country as soon as the package was approved in late April. Of course, such a huge amount of aid has to be transferred in stages, but the first installment already made all the difference in the Kharkiv Oblast. Thanks to the ammunition and armored vehicles received from the US, the Ukrainian forces were able to fight back more and more as the offensive progressed. So while aiming to take advantage of the lack of aid, the Kremlin only managed to get the military aid package passed and delivered sooner. However, this isn't even the most consequential outcome of Russia's summer offensive. Thanks to this offensive, Ukraine's Western allies finally allowed the country to do something it had pleaded for since the invasion started: strike targets on Russian soil. You see, prior to June 2024, the Ukrainian forces were only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to defend their territories, including the occupied areas. This significantly limited their operational scope and the potential to disrupt the Russian war machine. Seeing all the initial chaos caused by the summer offensive, the US finally lifted the ban, with other major European allies like the UK and Germany following suit. However, it's important to note that the ban was only lifted partially. What does this mean? It means that Ukraine still can't use Western-supplied weapons to indiscriminately target Russia. It can only use these weapons to target border areas used to launch attacks on Ukraine during the Kharkiv offensive. Though not an ideal scenario, this permission has been sufficient to apply pressure to Russian supply lines and command posts, halting the summer offensive. Generally speaking, Ukraine starting to fight back has been one of the major reasons Russia's summer offensive failed. When the offensive was first announced, most military experts were rather pessimistic about Ukraine's fate due to the country's severe shortage of troops, shells, and pre-established defensive positions. But then Ukraine managed to adapt and overcome, as it always does. Each of these problems was gradually being addressed. The lack of shells was covered by the incoming Western aid. To address the lack of soldiers, Zelensky signed a bill lowering the mobilization age for combat duty from 27 to 25. Though the numbers of subsequently drafted soldiers are kept a secret, it's clear that the bill helped Ukraine generate more fighting power in Kharkiv and beyond almost instantly. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin didn't account for this when preparing the summer offensive, just as it didn't account for the arrival of the aid or stiff Ukrainian resistance. Echoing the sentiment of the entire invasion, Russia's miscalculations cost the country any potential victory in Kharkiv and beyond. All things considered, it becomes obvious why the Kharkiv offensive has been a huge failure. Not only did the offensive fail to accomplish any of the supposed goals, but it also actually weakened Russia's position in Ukraine. The Russian forces practically squandered firepower, which might have made a difference in another portion of the 600-mile front line. That's not to mention that the offensive cost thousands of soldiers' lives after being forced to attack on foot while unprotected. But take heart. Despite the challenges, Ukraine has shown remarkable strength and determination in the face of Russia's aggression. While there have been signs of continued Russian activity in Kharkiv as of August 1st, these are more of a reflection of Russia's desperation than its strength. Ukraine has successfully averted the worst-case scenario, and this is no small feat. With each passing day, Ukraine's forces grow stronger and more unified, ready to face whatever comes next. The journey is far from over, but Ukraine is more than capable of turning these ongoing challenges into future victories. So what do you think? Which will be next? Will it happen in Kharkiv or another part of the front line? If you're going with Kharkiv, do you think Russia has any chance to recover in this region, or is the summer offensive officially a lost cause?